Something she said made me focus completely. "I promise to build a family with you based on love, loyalty, and truth," she said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "I promise to always be honest with you, to support you, and to put our family first above everything else." I had to press my lips together to keep from laughing. Love, loyalty, and truth. From a woman who'd forged my signature on a federal loan application. From a woman who'd just seated me next to the kitchen because I wasn't real family. From a woman who'd built her entire life on the foundation of lies her parents had created. The ceremony concluded with Daniel kissing his bride while guests applauded. The photographer captured it all, every angle, every moment, every smile that would look so different when people saw these photos in a few hours. Guests began moving from the ceremony space into the reception hall. I stayed back, letting the crowd flow around me, and pulled out my phone. 3 text messages were waiting. From my attorney, "Standing by, ready when you are." From my banker, "Confirmed, protocols are active." From Helen, "Watching, proceed when ready." I typed quick responses to each, then made my way to the reception hall. The room was even more opulent than the ceremony space, if that was possible. Tables draped in ivory silk centerpieces that must have cost thousands each, a champagne tower that belonged in a museum. The head table was positioned on a raised platform so everyone could see Caroline and Daniel. Behind them was a large screen where photos from their engagement would play throughout the evening. I found table 18 exactly where I'd seen it on the seating chart, tucked in the far corner next to the swinging kitchen doors, positioned so that servers would have to squeeze past our chairs every time they brought out a course. The table was smaller than the others, with cheaper linens and simpler centerpieces. 5 other people were already seated: Caroline's elderly great-aunt, who was nearly deaf, 2 distant cousins whose names I'd forgotten, and a couple who looked completely confused about why they'd been seated in social Siberia. I took my seat and placed my clutch on the table. Inside was my phone, a copy of the forged loan documents and a letter Margaret had written me years ago. Everything I needed. The reception began with toasts and dinner. I barely tasted the food. I watched Caroline hold court at the head table, watched her laugh and smile and pose for endless photographs. I watched Richard and Susan beam with pride at their daughter's triumph. I watched Daniel try to look happy while his mother sat ramrod straight at her table, her expression unreadable. And I waited. As the reception began and champagne flowed, Emily took her seat at table 18 next to the kitchen, and waited for Caroline to make her final mistake. Dinner was served in courses, each one more elaborate than the last. Filet mignon with truffle butter, lobster tail with drawn lemon sauce, sides that had been arranged like works of art on bone china plates. At table 18, we received the same food as everyone else, but the servers had to perform an awkward ballet to reach us, squeezing between our chairs and the kitchen doors that kept swinging open with crashes and the shouted orders of the catering staff. Every few minutes, someone would rush past with a tray, and I'd have to pull my chair in to avoid being hit. The elderly great-aunt to my left kept asking what people were saying because she couldn't hear over the kitchen noise. One of the distant cousins spilled wine on the tablecloth when a server bumped her elbow. The couple who'd been seated with us, I'd finally figured out they were +1s of someone who'd RSVP'd late, kept exchanging uncomfortable glances, clearly aware they'd been relegated to the worst seats in the house. Other tables were far enough from the chaos to enjoy their meals in peace. They could hear the speeches and the music. They could see the photo montage playing on the screen behind the head table. We got glimpses between servers and the occasional clear view when both kitchen doors happened to be closed at the same time. I watched it all with the detached calm of someone who knew exactly how the evening was going to end. After dinner, the first dance began. Caroline and Daniel swayed to some romantic song I didn't recognize while guests watched and cameras flashed. Then the father-daughter dance with Richard beaming like he'd accomplished something meaningful. Then the mother-son dance, though I noticed Helen's expression remained neutral throughout, her posture stiff as Daniel guided her in mechanical circles. As the general dancing began, Caroline started making her rounds. This was her moment, her chance to visit each table and accept congratulations from Dallas society. She moved through the room like royalty, stopping to pose for photos, air-kissing women in designer gowns, laughing at jokes from men in expensive suits. Her bridesmaids followed her like an entourage, all of them in matching pink dresses. All of them slightly drunk on champagne and the reflected glory of being part of Caroline's special day. It took her 40 minutes to work her way to table 18. By then, she'd had at least 4 glasses of champagne. I could see it in the flush of her cheeks, the slightly glazed brightness of her eyes, the way her laugh had gotten louder and less controlled. I stood as she approached, smoothing my navy dress. "Caroline, it's been a beautiful ceremony. Congratulations." She turned and I saw genuine surprise flicker across her face, as if she'd genuinely forgotten I was there. Then the surprise melted into something else. Something cruel and delighted. "Oh, Emily." She laughed loud enough that people at nearby tables turned to look. "I'm so glad you could make it. How are you enjoying your table?" One of her bridesmaids, I recognized her from Caroline's sorority days, looked at our position by the kitchen and giggled into her champagne glass. "It's fine," I said evenly. "Thank you for including me." "Well, of course we included you." Caroline gestured broadly at table 18, making sure her bridesmaids and everyone within earshot was paying attention. "I mean, I had to put you somewhere, and you know how it is with seating charts, you have to be strategic about placement." Another bridesmaid, bolder than the first, asked with faux innocence, "Caroline, why is your sister sitting all the way back here?" Caroline's smile widened. She was enjoying this, I realized. This was the moment she'd been waiting for all night, maybe her whole life. The chance to publicly establish the hierarchy to make sure everyone understood exactly where I ranked in her world. "Oh, didn't you see the seating chart?" She laughed again, that bright, brittle sound that carried across the ballroom. "Adopted kids sit in the kitchen. This table is for real family." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. I watched the reactions ripple outward. One of her bridesmaids gasped, then tried to turn it into a cough. The elderly great-aunt, who apparently could hear when it mattered, looked at Caroline with horror. Guests at the nearest tables went silent, their conversations dying mid-sentence. A few people looked away, embarrassed to witness this moment. At the head table 20 feet away, Richard was chuckling into his wine glass. Susan smiled and shook her head indulgently, as if Caroline had made a slightly inappropriate but ultimately harmless joke. Neither of them said a word in my defense. The ballroom didn't go completely silent. The orchestra was still playing. Conversations continued at tables too far away to hear. But in our immediate area, there was a collective held breath, a waiting to see what I would do. I smiled. Not a fake smile, not a hurt smile, but a real smile. Calm and cold and absolutely certain. "You're right," I said softly. "I should go." Before Caroline could respond, the wedding planner appeared with a photographer in tow. "Caroline, it's time for the signing ceremony. We need to do this before we cut the cake." Caroline's attention immediately shifted, her cruelty forgotten as quickly as it had appeared. "Oh, perfect timing. Come on, girls, you have to watch this." I stayed where I was as Caroline swept away with her entourage. Near the head table, a platform had been set up with an easel displaying the investment contract, $50 million for Daniel's resort development, signed by Margaret Industries and Hartley Development Group. It was all part of the performance, the symbolic merger of two families through business and marriage. Richard stepped up to the microphone, his voice booming across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment. We have something special planned. As many of you know, my new son-in-law Daniel is a brilliant real estate developer. Tonight, we're not just joining two people in marriage, we're joining two companies in partnership. Caroline and Daniel will now sign the official investment agreement, marking the beginning of a beautiful collaboration." Applause rippled through the crowd. Photographers moved into position. Caroline stepped up to the platform and Richard handed her the Mont Blanc pen I'd given her, the one engraved with, "May you always sign your own name." She held it up for the cameras, grinning. "Look at this beautiful pen my sister gave me. It's perfect for this moment." I watched from table 18 as she signed with an exaggerated flourish, her signature large and confident across the bottom of the contract. Daniel signed next, his hand steadier than his expression. More applause, more photos. Caroline kissed the contract dramatically, leaving a lipstick print, and everyone laughed. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady as I opened my messages and typed 6 words to my banker: cancel the contract, execute protocol. I hit send and watched the message change to delivered. Then I opened a second message thread and typed 3 words to my attorney: release the documents, now. Send. Delivered. I stood, smoothed my dress one final time, and picked up my clutch. I began walking toward the exit, moving slowly and deliberately past the tables of Dallas society, past the orchestra, past the elaborate floral arrangements that had cost more than most people earned in a year. No one noticed at first. Everyone was still focused on Caroline at the platform, still applauding the signing ceremony. Then I saw it happen. A phone buzzed on the head table. Richard pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his face went pale. Another phone buzzed. Then another. Susan grabbed hers, read something, and her hand flew to her mouth. I kept walking. Behind me, I heard Richard's voice, no longer booming, but sharp with panic. What do you mean the funding's been withdrawn? I heard Caroline's confusion. What's happening? I heard the murmur of the crowd shifting from celebration to confusion. I reached the exit and pushed through the doors into the hallway. Behind me, chaos was beginning to erupt. By the time Emily reached the exit, 3 things had happened. The bank had withdrawn $50 million in funding, the attorney had filed legal papers, and Daniel's mother had stood up with a video on her phone. I stood in the hotel hallway just outside the ballroom doors, watching through the small windows as the scene inside began to unravel. My car was waiting downstairs, but I wanted to see the first few minutes. I wanted to witness the exact moment everything collapsed. Richard was at the head table, his phone pressed to his ear, his face cycling through shades of red and purple. I could see his mouth moving, see him gesturing frantically, though I couldn't hear the words through the heavy doors. Susan had gone pale, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips as she stared at her own phone screen. Caroline was still at the platform, the Mont Blanc pen clutched in her hand, confusion written across her face. She looked from her parents to Daniel, trying to understand what was happening. Daniel had his own phone out now, and whatever he was reading made him sink into the nearest chair. Within 5 minutes, the whispers had spread through the entire ballroom. Guests were checking their phones, leaning toward each other, the murmur of 200 conversations building like a wave. I saw a reporter someone must have invited press to cover the society wedding pull out a notebook and start writing furiously. Caroline finally processed enough to grab her own phone. I watched her dial, watched her face transform from confused to furious, as whoever answered apparently gave her news she didn't want to hear. Her voice carried even through the doors. What do you mean, withdrawn? You can't just withdraw $50 million. But they could, and they had. First National Bank of Texas had received a courtesy notification from my attorney 1 hour before the signing ceremony, alerting them to irregularities in previous loan applications involving the Crawford family, and providing copies of the forged documents. The bank had verified the information, discovered that Caroline's earlier loan was indeed fraudulent, and immediately frozen all Crawford-related accounts pending investigation. The resort deal financing, which had been contingent on Margaret Industries' financial stability, evaporated the moment the bank flagged the fraud. Richard tried to take control. He grabbed the microphone and attempted to address the crowd, something about minor technical difficulties, and nothing to be concerned about. But his voice shook, and nobody was listening anymore. That's when Helen Whitmore stood up. She was seated at table 7, far enough from the chaos to maintain perfect composure. She held her phone in one hand, and as she rose, the room gradually quieted, people turning to see what this formidable woman was about to do. Helen walked to the DJ booth with the measured steps of someone who'd spent 40 years commanding boardrooms. She said something to the DJ, who quickly stopped the music. Then she held up a small adapter cable I'd given her 2 days ago, one that would connect her phone to the ballroom's audio-visual system. Ladies and gentlemen, Helen's voice came through the speakers, clear and cold as ice. Before this evening continues, there's something you all need to see. The projection screen behind the head table flickered to life. The photo montage of Caroline and Daniel's engagement disappeared, replaced by shaky phone footage. It took a moment for people to orient themselves to recognize what they were seeing. Then the audio kicked in, and Caroline's voice filled the ballroom. "Oh, didn't you see the seating chart? Adopted kids sit in the kitchen. This table is for real family." The video showed everything. Caroline's sneering smile, her bridesmaids giggling, the cruelty in her eyes as she delivered the insult. And in the background, clearly visible at the head table, Richard chuckling and Susan shaking her head with that indulgent smile. The playback quality was crystal clear. Helen had been holding her phone at chest level, steady and well lit. Every detail was visible. Every word was audible. The ballroom had gone absolutely silent. 200 people watched Caroline humiliate me in high definition, watched my parents condone it with their laughter, watched the casual cruelty of a family that had apparently forgotten they were surrounded by witnesses. When the video ended, Helen disconnected her phone and spoke directly to her son. "Daniel, we're leaving. I will not allow you to marry into a family that treats human beings this way. This wedding celebration is over." Daniel stood mechanically, his face the color of chalk. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. What could he possibly say? He'd just watched his future wife reveal exactly who she was, and his future in-laws endorse it with their laughter. Caroline finally found her voice. "You can't just leave Daniel, tell her she can't." But Helen was already walking toward the exit, her posture ramrod straight, and after a moment's hesitation, Daniel followed. I watched through the window as they passed within feet of where I stood in the hallway. Helen saw me and gave a single sharp nod. Daniel couldn't meet my eyes. Before Richard could process what had just happened, before he could attempt damage control or explanation, the speakers crackled to life again. This time it was my voice, a recording I'd made the night before in my hotel room. "Before I leave tonight, I want you all to hear something." My recorded voice was calm, almost conversational. 20 years ago, my grandmother Margaret installed a comprehensive security system throughout the Crawford family home and Margaret Industries offices. Audio and video recording all documented and stored. Signs were posted as required by Texas law. Everything was legal. Everything was preserved. I'd edited together the footage, carefully selecting the moments that revealed the most truth with the least ambiguity. The audio waveforms appeared on the projection screen as the voices played. Richard's voice, 10 years old but perfectly clear. "Yes, we kept her," Margaret insisted. "But she's just a burden we have to carry. Once Margaret's gone, we'll handle it." Caroline's voice 5 years ago. "I'll just forge her signature. She's too weak to fight back anyway." Susan's voice 3 years ago at what sounded like a dinner party. "That adopted brat should be grateful we kept her. Some children don't get even that much." There were more clips. Dozens of moments over 20 years where they'd revealed their true feelings, their real intentions, their utter contempt for the girl they'd been paid to raise. Margaret's security system had captured it all, and I'd spent weeks cataloging every relevant conversation. The gasps and murmurs from the crowd built into actual shocked exclamations. I saw hands flying to mouths, saw people turning to their neighbors in disbelief. This wasn't hearsay or gossip. This was documentation. Proof. The Crawford family's ugly truth laid bare for Dallas society to witness. My recorded message continued. "My grandmother heard everything. She documented everything. She knew exactly who they were. And now you know too. As for Margaret Industries, I'm exercising my rights as the majority shareholder. Effective immediately, Richard Crawford is removed as CEO and Caroline Crawford is terminated as COO. The company will be restructured under new leadership. This isn't revenge. This is justice." The recording ended. The screen went dark, and the ballroom exploded into chaos. I didn't wait to see more. I turned from the window and walked quickly to the elevator, rode down to the lobby, and stepped outside where my car was waiting at the curb. My driver, a professional I'd hired specifically for tonight, opened the door without a word. As we pulled away from the Four Seasons, I looked back one last time. Through the hotel's glass facade, I could see people streaming out of the ballroom. Some looked angry, some looked shocked. Some were already on their phones, undoubtedly calling friends or press contacts to share what they'd just witnessed. Inside, Richard would be trying to salvage something, anything from the wreckage. Caroline would be sobbing or screaming or both. Susan would be calculating how to minimize the damage to their social standing. And somewhere in that chaos was the wedding that was supposed to be Caroline's triumph, now transformed into the public documentation of her downfall. My phone buzzed, a text from Helen. "Well done, leaving now, we'll call tomorrow." Another from my attorney. "Papers filed. Crawford Industries board meeting scheduled for Monday. You're officially in control." I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. It was done. The revenge I'd planned for 10 years had been executed perfectly. They'd lost the company, lost their reputations, lost everything in the space of an hour. But as the adrenaline began to fade, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction or triumph or joy, emptiness. Within 24 hours, the video went viral. Within a week, the family lost everything. But Emily's revenge was far from over because the hardest part was yet to come. I flew back to Boston the next morning and watched the world catch fire from my apartment overlooking the harbor. The video went viral within 12 hours. Someone at the wedding had recorded Helen's playback on their own phone and posted it to Twitter with the caption, "Dallas socialite humiliates adopted sister at her own wedding, instantly regrets it." By midnight, it had 1 million views. By morning, 10 million. TikTok users were stitching it with reaction videos. Instagram meme accounts were turning Caroline's sneer into content. The hashtag #KitchenCaroline was trending nationwide. Major news outlets picked it up by Monday. CNN ran a segment titled, "Texas Heiress Humiliates Adopted Sister at Wedding Then Loses Everything." The Dallas Morning News published a deep dive into the Crawford family's history, complete with interviews from former employees who'd witnessed years of my mistreatment. The Atlantic ran an opinion piece about adoption trauma and family cruelty that used my story as the central case study. I sat on my couch with my laptop scrolling through coverage I knew I shouldn't be reading. BuzzFeed had compiled the 15 most brutal reactions to Kitchen Caroline. Elite Daily published What the Crawford Wedding Disaster Teaches Us About Toxic Families. Someone had created a Change.org petition demanding that Caroline be banned from all social media platforms for promoting discrimination against adopted children. Caroline's carefully curated Instagram account had been deleted, but screenshots lived forever. People were resharing her old posts with new captions mocking her hypocrisy. The engagement photos where she'd gushed about family and love were now memes with text overlays. When you say family values but mean only your family. By Tuesday, Richard was facing calls for resignation from every board he sat on. The country club revoked his membership. The charitable foundation that bore Margaret's name issued a statement distancing itself from current family leadership and announcing they'd be reaching out to me about potential restructuring. Helen Whitmore gave an interview to Fortune magazine that ran Wednesday morning. I read it over coffee, my hands shaking slightly, as I recognized my own story told from her perspective. What I witnessed at that wedding was appalling, Helen had said. Emily Crawford conducted herself with grace and dignity despite years of systematic cruelty. She built a successful career through her own merit, while her family took credit for her grandmother's legacy. The moment Caroline revealed her true nature, I knew my son could not be part of that family. I'm only sorry it took that long to see it clearly. The journalist had asked Helen if she thought Emily's response was justified. Helen's answer was perfect. Emily didn't humiliate Caroline. Caroline humiliated herself. Emily simply ensured there were consequences. On Thursday, I held my first board meeting as the acting CEO of Margaret Industries. The conference room in Dallas was tense, filled with executives who'd worked under Richard for a decade. I'd flown in for the day and planned to fly out that evening. Effective immediately, Richard Crawford is removed as CEO. I announced, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of saying those words out loud. Caroline Crawford is terminated as COO. I'll be serving as interim CEO while we conduct a search for permanent leadership. No one argued. They'd all seen the videos. They'd all read the news coverage. Some of them looked relieved. I spent the next hour outlining immediate changes. Canceled the resort deal, froze all non-essential expenses, initiated an audit of the last 5 years of financial statements. And then I addressed the elephant in the room. Regarding the forged loan in my name, I'm demanding full repayment with interest. That's $2.8 million. I've already filed the paperwork with the bank. If repayment isn't made within 30 days, I'll be pursuing legal action. One of the executives raised his hand tentatively. Does Caroline have those kinds of assets? No, I said simply. She doesn't. Caroline's lifestyle had been entirely funded by company credit cards I'd now frozen. Her apartment was a rental. Her car was leased. Her designer wardrobe and jewelry were probably worth something, but not anywhere close to $2.8 million. She had no savings, no investments, no property. She'd spent every penny she'd ever gotten her hands on. Richard wasn't much better off. Years of embezzlement had funded his own expensive tastes, but he'd never built real wealth. He'd lived like he was rich while actually drowning in debt. With his salary terminated and his access to company funds cut off, he was essentially broke. The Crawford estate was legally mine, part of Margaret's inheritance. I'd already had my attorney send an eviction notice to Richard and Susan, giving them 30 days to vacate. The house where I'd spent my childhood feeling like an intruder was now mine, and they were the ones being forced out. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't feel as satisfying as I'd imagined it would. On Friday afternoon, my phone rang with Daniel's number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Emily. His voice was quiet, strained. I wanted to call sooner, but I didn't know what to say. Hello, Daniel. The wedding's been annulled. Or rather, it never happened. We never filed the license. Caroline and I are done. My mother made that very clear, not that I needed convincing after what I saw. I'm sorry, I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. Don't be. You saved me twice now. Once from bankruptcy, and now from marrying someone who would have destroyed me. He paused. I should have stood up for you at that table. I should have said something when Caroline made that comment. I'm sorry I didn't. You were in an impossible position. That's a kind way of putting it. Emily, I want you to know I've issued a public statement about my mother and me apologizing for any role we played in your mistreatment, about wishing you well. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I needed to say something. Thank you, I said quietly. That means something. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment as the sun set over Boston Harbor, turning the water gold and then purple and then black. My laptop sat open on the coffee table, still showing news coverage. My phone buzzed periodically with messages from colleagues, from Helen, from my attorney, with updates on the legal proceedings. I'd won. By every measurable standard, I'd won completely. I had the company. I had the money. I had public sympathy and validation. Caroline was a social pariah. Richard was unemployed and potentially facing criminal charges. They'd lost everything. So why did I feel so empty? I thought about Margaret's letter, the one I'd read 100 times over the past 10 years. Choose grace over revenge. Had I chosen revenge? The answer was obvious. But Margaret had also said I'd face a choice between destroying my enemies and offering them a chance to be better. She'd said the 10-year deadline was about whether I could offer them redemption. I'd exposed them. I'd taken back what was mine. But had I offered them anything except destruction, I pulled out Margaret's letter from the wooden box I kept on my bookshelf and read it again by lamplight. When that day comes, choose the harder path. Choose grace. The 10-year deadline Margaret had set in her will was still 2 years away. I had time to decide what grace looked like, whether it meant letting them rot in the consequences of their actions, or whether it meant something harder. Something I didn't yet understand. I was still thinking about it when I fell asleep on the couch, Margaret's letter resting on my chest. And then 3 weeks later, a letter arrived. It was from Caroline. And it changed everything. The envelope arrived at my Boston office on a Tuesday afternoon, forwarded from my Dallas address. It was wrinkled and stained as if it had been carried in someone's pocket for days before being mailed. My name was written across the front in handwriting. I recognized immediately Caroline's elaborate script, but shakier than I'd ever seen it, the letters uneven and uncertain. I stared at it for a full minute before opening it. Part of me wanted to throw it away unread. Part of me was curious what new manipulation she'd concocted. I finally slid it open with my letter opener and pulled out 2 pages of lined notebook paper, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore. "Emily," it began. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've been cruel my entire life. I'm not asking you to forget what I did. I'm asking you to let me try to make it right." I read the letter standing at my desk, my coffee growing cold beside me. Caroline's words were raw in a way I'd never heard from her before. No justifications, no excuses, just a stark accounting of where she was. She'd lost everything. The apartment she'd been renting was gone. She couldn't make the payments without access to company funds. Her friends had disappeared the moment the scandal broke. Daniel wouldn't take her calls. She was living in a Motel 6 off the highway, the kind of place where rooms cost $40 a night and came with suspicious stains on the carpet. "But worse than losing everything external," she wrote. "I've lost any sense of who I am. I look in the mirror and I don't recognize myself. I've spent my entire life being Caroline Crawford, the pretty one, the popular one, the one everyone wanted to be around. Without that, I don't know what's left. I've been diagnosed with severe depression. Some days I don't want to keep living. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty. I'm writing because I need you to know I'm sorry. I was cruel to you because I was jealous, because Grandma Margaret loved you in a way she never loved me, and I couldn't stand it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know that I finally understand what I did. Please, just meet me once. Let me apologize in person. That's all I'm asking. Caroline." I read the letter twice more, looking for the angle, the manipulation, the hidden agenda. Caroline had spent 30 years lying, performing, saying whatever she needed to say to get what she wanted. Why should this be any different? I called a private investigator I'd worked with before, a former FBI agent named Marcus Chen, who specialized in due diligence and background checks. "I need you to verify some information for me. Quietly. No one can know I'm asking." Marcus called me back 3 days later. "Your sister is exactly where she says she is. Motel 6 on Route 35, room 127. She's been there for 2 weeks, paid through the end of the month with what looks like the last of her cash. I verified she's been seeing a therapist twice a week at a community mental health clinic, sliding scale fees for people without insurance. The therapist can't discuss specifics, but confirmed Caroline is a patient and that the depression diagnosis is legitimate. She sold most of her designer clothes and jewelry to a consignment shop. Got maybe $5,000 total. That's all she has left." "Is she working?" I asked. "Applied to about 20 places. Retail, restaurants, administrative work. No one's calling back. Her name's poison right now. Everyone's seen the videos." I thanked Marcus and sat with the information for 2 days. Caroline wasn't lying about her circumstances. She really had lost everything. She really was living in a motel, seeing a therapist she probably couldn't afford, trying and failing to find work in a city where everyone knew her name for all the wrong reasons. The question was, did I care I called the number she'd included at the bottom of the letter? She answered on the first ring, her voice tentative. "Hello? It's Emily. I'll meet you. Thursday afternoon, 3 o'clock. There's a coffee shop called Common Grounds on Commerce Street. Do you know it?" "I'll find it. Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet." I said, and hung up. Thursday afternoon, I arrived 15 minutes early and took a table in the back corner where I could see the door. The coffee shop was deliberately neutral territory, busy enough that we wouldn't be overheard, public enough that there would be witnesses if this went badly. Caroline arrived exactly on time, and I almost didn't recognize her. The woman who walked through the door bore little resemblance to the bride who'd humiliated me 3 weeks ago. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose her collarbones sharp beneath an old sweater I vaguely remembered from years ago. No makeup, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, jeans that looked like they'd come from Target. She moved hesitantly, like someone expecting to be told to leave. She saw me and walked over, not sitting until I gestured to the chair across from me. "Thank you for meeting me." I didn't respond, just watched her face. She looked exhausted, defeated, and for the first time in our lives, genuinely vulnerable. "I don't know how to start," she said quietly. "I've been practicing what to say for days, but now that you're here, it all seems inadequate." "Try anyway." She took a shaky breath. "I hated you because I wanted to be you. That's the truth I've finally had to face. Grandma Margaret loved you in a way she never loved me. She spent time with you, taught you things, looked at you like you mattered. And I couldn't stand it. I was supposed to be the special one. I was the real granddaughter, the one with the Crawford blood. But she loved you more. And instead of asking myself why, instead of trying to be someone worth loving, I destroyed you. Or tried to. I was cruel because I was jealous. And I'm sorry." I took a sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch. Sorry doesn't undo 20 years of abuse. Sorry doesn't erase what you said at your wedding. You called me a parasite, Caroline. You forged my name on legal documents. You stole from me. You spent our entire childhood making me feel like I didn't deserve to exist. Why should I believe you've changed? "I don't know if I can change," she said, and I heard something in her voice I'd never heard before, genuine uncertainty, maybe even humility. "But I want to try. I have to try. Because I've been this person who could say those things and do those things. I can't be her anymore. I can't live with myself if I stay her." "What do you want from me?" I asked bluntly. "Nothing. I mean, I'm not asking for money or help or forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did. That I'm sorry. That's all." I studied her face, looking for the calculation, the performance, the angle. But all I saw was a broken woman who'd finally run out of masks to wear. "I'll think about it," I said, standing. "That's all I can promise right now." Caroline nodded, tears starting to stream down her face. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." I left her sitting there, walked out of the coffee shop into the Dallas afternoon, and drove back to my hotel. I had a flight to Boston that evening. I'd think about Caroline's apology from a distance where I could be objective and rational, but the image of her face, gaunt, exhausted, genuinely remorseful, stayed with me through the airport, through the flight, through the taxi ride home. I was still thinking about it 2 days later when my phone rang at 6 in the morning. The caller ID showed a Dallas area code I didn't recognize. "Ms. Crawford, this is Parkland Hospital. We have Caroline Crawford here. You're listed as her emergency contact. I'm afraid she's attempted suicide." I was on the next flight to Dallas. The nurse had said Caroline was stable but would need psychiatric evaluation before being released. She'd taken an entire bottle of sleeping pills, generic ones, bought from the drugstore, and had written a note that the motel clerk found when he came to check on her after she hadn't responded to housekeeping's knock. Parkland Hospital's emergency wing smelled like antiseptic and desperation. I followed the signs to the ICU waiting area and found Susan sitting alone in a plastic chair, her face blotchy and aged in a way I'd never seen before. She looked up when I entered, and something raw and angry flashed across her features. "Are you happy now?" Her voice was hoarse, broken. "You got your revenge. You destroyed us. You took everything. Is this what you wanted? Your sister nearly dead in a hospital bed." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to form a response. Was this what I wanted? I'd wanted justice. I'd wanted them to understand what they'd done to me. I'd wanted consequences for 20 years of cruelty. But this Caroline unconscious in the ICU, her stomach pumped, her life hanging in some uncertain balance. No, this wasn't what I wanted. No, I said quietly. This isn't what I wanted. Susan laughed bitterly. Well, you got it anyway. Congratulations, Emily. You won. A nurse appeared before I could respond, telling me Caroline was awake and asking if I wanted to see her. Susan didn't move, didn't offer to come with me. So I followed the nurse alone down the sterile hallway to a small room where Caroline lay connected to monitors and IV lines. She looked worse than she had at the coffee shop. Her skin was gray, her lips cracked and dry. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry you had to see this, she whispered. I'm sorry for everything. I pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down heavily. For a long moment I just looked at her, this woman who'd tormented me my entire life, who'd made me feel worthless, who'd called me a parasite in front of 200 people, and who was now broken in a way that terrified me. I'm sorry too, I heard myself say. Caroline blinked confused. You're sorry for what? I had the right to expose you. I had the right to take back what was mine. But I should have done it differently. I thought of Margaret sitting in her garden teaching me about grace and forgiveness. I should have offered you a way forward, not just a way down. My grandmother wanted me to choose grace. I forgot that. But I'm choosing it now. Caroline started crying, harder silent tears streaming down her face. I don't deserve your grace. I don't deserve anything from you. Maybe not, I said, but grace isn't about what people deserve. That's what makes it grace. I spent the next hour talking with Caroline's doctors and the hospital psychiatrist. She would need intensive therapy, possibly medication, definitely ongoing support. She couldn't go back to that motel room. She needed structure, purpose, something to rebuild her life around. When I returned to her room, Caroline was staring at the ceiling, her expression blank. I have a proposal, I said, and she turned to look at me. I'll pay for your treatment, therapy, medication, whatever the doctors recommend. I'll find you a place to live, nothing fancy but safe and clean, and I'll give you a job at Margaret Industries. Caroline's eyes widened. Emily, I can't. Let me finish. Not in management. Not anywhere near decision-making. You'll start at the bottom. Administrative work may be helping with the charitable foundation we're rebuilding in Grandma's name. You'll work for every dollar. You'll prove yourself through actions, not words. And if you fall back into your old ways, if you lie, if you steal, if you treat people with cruelty, I walk away and you're on your own. Do you understand? She nodded slowly, fresh tears spilling over. Why are you doing this? Because holding on to revenge was killing me too, I said. Just slower. And because my grandmother believed people could change if they were given a real chance. I don't know if you can change Caroline, but I'm offering you the chance to try. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll try. I promise I'll try. I squeezed her hand once, then stood to leave. At the door, I paused. Caroline. This isn't forgiveness. Not yet. This is an opportunity. What you do with it is up to you. I left the hospital as the sun was setting over Dallas, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Susan was gone from the waiting room. I'd deal with her and Richard later. Right now I needed air and space to process what I'd just done. Had I made the right choice? I didn't know. Margaret's letter said to choose grace, but it didn't say grace would feel satisfying or clear or right. It just said it was the harder path. And God, it was hard. My phone buzzed as I reached my rental car. A text from an unknown number. Ms. Crawford, this is Maria Gonzalez. I was the housekeeper at the Crawford estate when you were a child. I saw the news. There's something you need to know about your family. Something Margaret wanted you to know. Can we meet? Emily had chosen forgiveness. But the test wasn't over, because someone from Emily's past was about to reveal a secret that would change everything she thought she knew. I met Maria Gonzalez 3 days later at a small cafe near the hospital. She was waiting at a corner table when I arrived, a woman in her mid-70s with silver hair and kind eyes that looked tired and sad. She stood when she saw me, her movements careful like someone whose body had started to betray her. "Emily," she said softly, "you've grown into such a beautiful woman. I would have recognized you anywhere. You have your father's eyes." We sat and she ordered tea with hands that trembled slightly. I waited, my heart pounding, as she pulled a worn envelope from her purse. "I debated whether to contact you," she began. "For years I told myself it wasn't my place. But then I saw that video from the wedding. I saw what they did to you. And I realized you deserved to know everything. Margaret wanted you to know, but she couldn't find the courage to tell you herself." She slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting dated just 2 weeks ago. "I'm dying," Maria said simply. "Cancer. The doctors give me maybe 3 months. Before I go, I need to tell you about your mother. About Sarah." I opened the letter and began to read as Maria spoke, her voice filling in details that the written words couldn't capture. Sarah had been young when she met James, only 22 to his 25. She'd been beautiful and kind with a laugh that could light up a room, but she'd been fighting demons that predated James by years. Addiction had its claws in her since her teenage years, and despite multiple attempts at treatment, she couldn't break free. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant, James had been overjoyed. He'd believed that becoming parents would give Sarah a reason to get clean, to fight harder. For a few months, it worked. Sarah stopped using. She glowed with the promise of motherhood. James bought a house, prepared a nursery, talked constantly about the future they'd build together. Emily was born healthy and beautiful on a June morning. For 6 months, Sarah held on. She loved her daughter desperately, fiercely. But the addiction was stronger than love, stronger than willpower, stronger than all the promises in the world. "I found her," Maria said quietly, tears running down her weathered face. "You were 6 months old. Sarah had put you down for a nap, and then she'd gone to her bathroom and taken too much. She never meant to leave you. She just wanted the pain to stop for a little while. But this time, she took too much." The letter described James's devastation. He'd blamed himself, convinced that if he'd loved Sarah better, helped her more, been more vigilant, she'd still be alive. He threw himself into being a single father, caring for Emily with a devotion that Margaret said was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Then, when Emily was 2 years old, James was driving home from a late business meeting. A drunk driver ran a red light. James died instantly. Margaret fell apart, Maria continued. She'd lost her husband years before, and now she'd lost her only child. And there you were, this tiny girl who looked just like James, a living reminder of everything she'd lost. She loved you desperately, but she couldn't bear to look at you without breaking down. Every time she held you, she saw James. Every smile reminded her of what she'd never get back. So Margaret made a choice born of grief and shame. She asked Richard and Susan, her company's trusted managers, people she'd known for years, to adopt Emily. She told them she'd support them financially, give them positions of power, ensure they'd never want for anything. In exchange, they'd raise Emily as their own, and Margaret would remain involved from a distance. "She thought she was doing the right thing," Maria said. "She thought you'd be better off with a young couple with a normal family. She didn't realize that Richard and Susan would resent you, that they'd see you as an obligation rather than a blessing. By the time she understood what was happening, years had passed, and she was too ashamed to tell you the truth." The letter's final paragraphs were blurred by my tears. Maria had written, "Margaret never told you because she was ashamed. Ashamed that she couldn't raise you herself after losing James. Ashamed that she let Richard and Susan treat you poorly. She thought if you knew you were truly her granddaughter, you'd hate her for not protecting you better. But she was wrong, Emily. She loved you more than anything in this world. Everything she did, the The recordings, the inheritance, the lessons, the forgiveness clause, it was all her way of trying to protect you from beyond the grave. I'm sorry you had to learn the truth this way. I sat in that cafe, the letter clutched in my shaking hands, and finally understood. Margaret's sadness when she looked at me, her strange comments about my father, her inability to tell me the truth. It had all been grief and guilt, shame and love twisted together in ways she couldn't untangle. She wanted to tell you so many times, Maria said. But she was terrified you'd hate her for failing you, for not being strong enough to raise you herself. I wiped my eyes and looked at this woman who'd kept Margaret's secret for so long. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for being brave enough to do what she couldn't. Maria reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She loved you, Emily. Never doubt that. Every decision she made, right or wrong, came from love. I left the cafe with Maria's letter carefully folded in my purse next to Margaret's original letter about forgiveness. 2 pieces of paper that together told the complete story of a woman who'd loved me but hadn't known how to save me from her own broken heart. That night alone in my hotel room, I whispered to the empty air, I forgive you, Grandma. I understand now. You did the best you could with a grief I can't imagine, and you gave me everything I needed to survive. Thank you. With the full truth finally known, Emily could move forward. But she had one more decision to make: what to do with Margaret Industries. Rebuild it in Margaret's honor, or let it go. 3 months after meeting Maria, I stood at a podium in the Margaret Industries Conference Center facing a room full of reporters, employees, and community leaders. I'd spent those months in constant motion restructuring the company, consulting with nonprofit experts, and designing a vision that would have made Margaret proud. My grandmother, Margaret Crawford, built this company on the belief that business should serve people, not just profit. I began, my voice steady despite my nerves. She believed in second chances. She believed that everyone deserves dignity and opportunity. Today, I'm announcing that Margaret Industries will be restructured as the Margaret Trust, a for-profit company with a social mission. I outlined the plan I'd spent months developing. 40% of annual profits would fund scholarships for adopted children and youth aging out of foster care. The company would launch job training programs for people rebuilding their lives after incarceration, addiction, or domestic violence. We'd partner with community organizations to create pathways from hardship to stability. My grandmother gave me chances when no one else would, I said, looking directly into the cameras. This company will honor her by giving others the chances I was denied. Because family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who believes in you, who gives you a reason to believe in yourself. The press conference made national news. Within a week, I had applications from nonprofits wanting to partner with us, from potential employees wanting to join the mission, and from hundreds of people sharing their own stories of adoption, foster care, and family rejection. Caroline was among the first hires for the new job training program. I'd kept my promise. She started at the bottom. Junior coordinator, reporting to a supervisor with 15 years of social work experience. Her salary was modest, her office was shared, and her responsibilities included things like photocopying workshop materials and setting up chairs for group sessions. I watched from a distance as she adjusted to this new reality. The first few weeks were clearly painful for her. She'd never worked a real job before, never had to show up on time, and follow someone else's directions. I saw her supervisor pull her aside more than once for corrections. But slowly, something changed. Caroline started arriving early to help set up. She stayed late to talk with program participants. I heard from her supervisor that she had a gift for connecting with people who were struggling, that her own recent fall from grace made her relatable in ways the other staff weren't. One day, about 2 months in, I stopped by the job training center unannounced. Through the window of a conference room, I saw Caroline sitting with a woman who looked to be in her 30s, helping her practice interview questions. The woman was crying, and Caroline was holding her hand, speaking quietly. Later, I learned the woman was a single mother fighting to regain custody of her children after losing them to substance abuse. Caroline's supervisor told me, "That participant said something interesting yesterday. She said Caroline understands what it's like to hit rock bottom, and that makes her different from the other counselors. It means something to people when they know you've really been there." The media narrative began to shift over the following months. The initial stories had been about scandal and revenge. Now they were about transformation and redemption. Forbes ran a feature titled, "Heiress Emily Crawford Turns Family Tragedy into Force for Good." The Dallas Morning News published a long-form piece about the Margaret Trust's first 6 months, including a sidebar about Caroline's journey from Kitchen Caroline to addiction counselor in training. Caroline gave one interview to a small nonprofit magazine that focused on recovery and second chances. I read it on a flight back to Boston. "I was cruel because I was broken," she'd said. "I spent 30 years defining myself by what I had: money, status, beauty, and when I lost all of that, I had no idea who I was underneath. Emily had every right to destroy me completely. Instead, she gave me something harder, a reason to rebuild. I'm not looking for praise or sympathy. I'm just trying to earn the gift she gave me. Every single day, I'm trying to be someone who deserves a second chance." Richard and Susan were not part of this redemption arc. I'd offered them nothing, and they'd asked for nothing. They'd moved to a small apartment in Fort Worth, living on Richard's pension, and whatever Susan had managed to save. The estate they'd lived in for 30 years now belonged to me, though I hadn't decided what to do with it yet. I didn't pursue criminal charges for Richard's embezzlement. Margaret's will had been clear about avoiding public lawsuits, and I'd already taken everything that mattered. Let him live with his shame quietly. That felt like enough punishment. Richard sent me a letter about 6 months after the restructuring was announced. It was short, written in the shaky handwriting of someone who'd aged a decade in a year. "Emily," it read, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know something. Margaret was right about you. She always said you were stronger than all of us, that you had something we'd never understand. She was right. You were always the strongest one. I'm sorry I couldn't see it until it was too late." I read the letter once, then filed it away with the others in Margaret's wooden box. Some apologies arrived too late to change anything. But they still deserved to be acknowledged. The company was thriving. Caroline was finding purpose. The scholarships were changing lives. Margaret's legacy was becoming something beautiful and redemptive. But there was one place I hadn't visited in 10 years, one part of my past I'd been avoiding, because I knew it would break me open in ways I wasn't ready for. Emily had rebuilt the company, helped Caroline find redemption, and honored Margaret's legacy. But there was one place she hadn't visited in 10 years: Margaret's garden. 1 year after the wedding, I finally drove back to the Crawford estate. I'd been avoiding it, finding excuses to handle everything through lawyers and property managers. But I woke up one Saturday morning in Boston and knew I couldn't put it off any longer. Some ghosts need to be faced in person. The estate looked smaller than I remembered, though that might have been perspective. I'd spent my childhood feeling small within these walls. The house was still maintained by a skeleton crew I'd kept on staff, but it had the hollow feeling of a place where no one actually lived. I let myself in with the key I'd never returned and stood in the foyer, breathing in air that smelled like furniture polish and absence. I walked through the house slowly, letting myself remember. The kitchen where I'd done homework alone while Caroline got tutoring in the study. The living room where family photos lined the mantel, every single one either excluding me or positioning me at the edges. The staircase I'd climbed thousands of times, always feeling like I was trespassing in someone else's home. I ran my hand along the wall of the hallway leading to what had been my bedroom, the smallest room in the house, despite there being 6 empty guest rooms no one ever used. I whispered to the walls, to the ghost of the girl I'd been, "I survived you." But it was Margaret's garden I'd really come to see. I walked through the house to the back door and stepped outside into late afternoon sunlight. The garden was overgrown, but somehow more beautiful for it. Margaret had always kept it meticulously maintained, every rosebush pruned, every path swept clean. Now it had gone a bit wild, roses climbing over their trellises in enthusiastic tangles, lavender spilling across the stone pathways, herbs growing thick and fragrant where they'd once been trimmed into neat rows. The stone bench where Margaret used to sit was covered in moss and bird droppings, shaded by a wisteria that had grown unchecked for a decade. I brushed off the seat as best I could and sat down, and that's when the grief finally caught up to me. I'd been so focused on revenge and then redemption, on restructuring the company and rebuilding relationships, that I'd never actually stopped to grieve. Not properly, not completely. I'd cried when I found Margaret's hidden documents. I'd cried when Maria told me about my mother. But I'd never cried for all of it, for every single thing I'd lost and never had. So I cried now. I cried for Margaret, for the grandmother who'd loved me but hadn't known how to save me from her own grief. I cried for my father James, who I'd never known, and for my mother Sarah, who'd fought demons she couldn't defeat. I cried for the little girl who'd watched Caroline's birthday party through a window, the teenager who'd overheard her father call her a burden, the young woman who'd left Dallas believing she had no family at all. I cried until my throat was raw, and my chest ached until there were no more tears left, and I was just sitting on a mossy bench in an overgrown garden, empty and exhausted and somehow lighter than I'd felt in years. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a memory surfaced. I was 10 years old, running to Margaret's garden after school, tears streaming down my face. Caroline had told everyone in her class that my real parents were drug addicts who didn't want me, and by lunchtime the rumor had spread to my grade. Kids I'd thought were friends had stared at me like I was contaminated. Margaret had been pruning roses when I'd burst into the garden. She'd dropped her shears immediately and pulled me into her arms, holding me while I sobbed against her shoulder. "Listen to me, sweet girl," she'd said, her voice fierce and certain. "You are not defined by who left you. You are defined by who you become. And you are going to be magnificent. Do you hear me, magnificent?" I'd believed her then in that moment, even though the belief never quite lasted. But sitting here now, 30 years old and in control of everything Margaret had built, I finally understood what she'd meant. I'd become someone who could have destroyed her enemies and chose to offer redemption instead. Someone who'd turned her pain into purpose, her trauma into transformation. "I hope I made you proud, Grandma," I whispered to the garden, to the roses she'd planted, to the memory of her hands in the soil. I tried to choose grace. I tried to be magnificent. The wind rustled through the wisteria, and for just a moment I could have sworn I felt her presence, not supernatural, just the echo of all the hours we'd spent here together, all the lessons she'd taught me, all the love she'd tried so hard to show. I looked around at the wild beauty of the neglected garden and made a decision. This place had been my sanctuary once. It could be that for others too. "I'm going to restore this garden," I said aloud, making it a promise. "I'm going to restore this whole house. Not to live in there are too many ghosts for that, but to turn it into something new. The headquarters for the scholarship program. A place where adopted kids and foster youth can come and feel seen. Where they can learn that they matter, that they belong, that their stories don't have to define their futures." I stood up from the bench, brushing moss from my jeans. This house made me feel small. But I'm going to make it a place where young people feel big, where they understand they're not defined by who left them, but by who they choose to become. I took one last look at the garden, at the roses climbing wild and free, and smiled. "This is my forgiveness, Grandma. Not for them, for me, for us. For everyone who was ever told they didn't belong." As I walked back toward the house and my car beyond, I felt lighter than I had in years. The grief was still there, but it had transformed into something else, not quite peace, but acceptance. Understanding. A sense that the circle was finally closing. I didn't notice the car parked at the end of the long driveway, or the woman with a camera who'd been filming the estate for a documentary about historic Dallas homes. I didn't know that she'd captured my entire walk through the garden, or that she'd recognized me from the viral videos. As Emily walked back to her car, she didn't know that someone was watching from the driveway, a documentary filmmaker who would soon make her story famous. The filmmaker who'd been watching from the driveway turned out to be Jessica Lim, an acclaimed documentary director whose previous film about refugee families had been nominated for an Oscar. She contacted me through my attorney 2 weeks after I'd visited the garden, requesting a meeting to discuss a potential documentary project about resilience and redefining family. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Dallas. Jessica was in her early 40s with intelligent eyes and a quiet intensity that made me trust her almost immediately. She'd brought her laptop and showed me clips from her previous work, intimate, powerful stories told with dignity and nuance. "I want to tell your story," she said simply. "Not as revenge porn or viral spectacle, but as something deeper. A story about what it means to survive a family that doesn't see you. About choosing grace when you have every right to choose destruction. About building your own belonging when you're told you don't deserve it." I hesitated, my coffee growing cold between my hands. "I don't want this to be about humiliating my family again. That's not who I want to be." "It won't be," Jessica promised. "This will be about you, about every person who's ever been told they don't belong and chose to build something beautiful anyway. Your family's cruelty is part of the story, but you, your strength, your choices, your transformation, that's what this film is really about." I agreed, but with strict conditions. No real names for Richard, Susan, or Caroline. They'd be referred to simply as the parents and the sister. The focus would be on the broader themes of adoption, foster care, and family rejection, not on personal revenge. And Caroline, who was still fragile in her recovery, would only be included if she agreed and if her identity was protected. The filming process took 6 months. Jessica interviewed me for hours, asking questions that made me cry and laugh and remember things I'd tried to forget. She spoke with foster youth and adopted adults who'd experienced similar rejection. She interviewed social workers and therapists and advocates who work with families torn apart by cruelty disguised as love. Caroline agreed to participate, but only with her face obscured and her voice electronically altered. I sat in on her interview, watching from behind the camera as she spoke with a raw honesty I'd never heard from her before. "I was the villain in someone's story," Caroline said, her distorted voice filling the small studio. "And I deserved to be. I spent 30 years treating my sister like she was worthless because I was terrified I was the worthless one. She had every right to destroy me completely. Instead, she gave me something harder, a chance to write a new chapter. I don't know if I'll ever fully deserve that gift, but I wake up every day trying to earn it." Jessica titled the documentary The Kitchen Girl. It premiered at Sundance Film Festival in January, 2 years after the wedding that had changed everything. I sat in the theater as the lights dimmed, my hands clenched in my lap, terrified of seeing my life displayed on a screen for strangers to judge. But what Jessica had created was beautiful. She'd woven my story together with those of other people who'd survived family rejection, a foster child who'd aged out of the system and built a successful tech company, a young man whose parents had disowned him for being gay and who now ran an LGBTQ youth shelter, a woman whose adoptive family had treated her as free labor until she escaped and became a civil rights attorney. The film ended with footage of the Margaret Trust's scholarship program, with young people talking about second chances and building belonging. The final shot was of me in Margaret's restored garden speaking directly to camera. They tried to make me small, but I chose to become magnificent. And if you're watching this and you've ever been told you don't belong, you do. You belong to yourself, and that's enough. The audience gave it a standing ovation. The Kitchen Girl won the Audience Award and was picked up by Netflix within a week. When it released globally 3 months later, my life changed overnight. My inbox flooded with thousands of messages. "Your story gave me the courage to leave my abusive family. I'm adopted and I've always felt like an outsider. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone. I forgave my estranged brother after watching this. We're talking again after 10 years. I read every message I could, crying over stories that mirrored my own, grateful that my pain had somehow become a bridge for others to cross. The documentary sparked a national conversation. Op-eds appeared in major newspapers about how adoptive and foster children are often treated as second-class members of their families. Organizations working with foster youth reported surges in donations and volunteer applications. The phrase, "adopted kids sit in the kitchen," became a rallying cry, a shorthand for the invisible cruelty that too many children experience. I was invited to speak at conferences on talk shows at universities. I partnered with national foster care organizations to expand the Margaret Trust's scholarship program to all 50 states. Senators contacted me about potential legislation to better protect adopted and foster children from family abuse. Emily had become a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of survival and grace. But there was one conversation I still hadn't had, one piece of the story that remained unfinished. 6 months after the documentary's release, I received a call from a hospice in Fort Worth. Richard Crawford was dying, and he was asking for me. The hospice nurse's voice was gentle but direct. Richard Crawford had liver disease end stage and had maybe a week left. He was asking for me. Susan was with him. Would I come? I sat in my Boston office staring out at the harbor, the phone still in my hand, and asked myself if I owed him this. The answer was no. I owed Richard Crawford nothing, but I realized I might owe it to myself to close this chapter completely, to look him in the eye one last time, and know that I'd survived him. I flew to Fort Worth the next morning. The hospice was quiet and surprisingly peaceful, with soft lighting and the faint scent of lavender. A nurse led me to Richard's room, and I paused at the doorway, steadying myself before entering. He looked nothing like the man I remembered. The Richard Crawford of my childhood had been imposing, loud, always taking up space. This man was skeletal, his skin gray and papery, his breathing labored even with the oxygen tube. Susan sat in a chair by the window, looking older and smaller than I'd ever seen her. Richard's eyes opened when I approached the bed. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been shame. "Emily," he whispered. "You came." "I came," I said, pulling a chair close to the bed, but not sitting. "You wanted to see me." He struggled to form words, his voice barely audible. "I know you don't owe me anything, but I wanted to say, I'm sorry, I was weak. Margaret made me raise you, gave us everything in exchange, and I resented it. Resented you. I took it out on a child who'd done nothing wrong. That was unforgivable." I looked at him for a long moment, this dying man who'd spent my entire childhood making me feel worthless. "Do you even understand what you stole from me?" I asked quietly. "Not money or inheritance, you stole my childhood. My sense of belonging. You made me believe I was worthless, that I should be grateful for scraps. Do you understand what that does to a child?" Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. "I know. God help me, I know. And I'll die with that guilt. It's eating me alive, Emily. Has been for years." From the corner, Susan spoke for the first time. "I'm sorry, too." Her voice was hoarse, broken. "I was jealous. Jealous of how much Margaret loved you. I wanted her to love Caroline that way, to look at my daughter with that same pride. Instead of trying to earn it, I punished you for having it. I was cruel because I was petty and small and jealous. You deserved better, Emily. You deserved so much better." I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of understanding. These weren't monsters. They were just broken, weak people who'd made terrible choices and were now facing the consequences. That didn't erase what they'd done, but it made them human. "I forgive you," I said, and watched Richard's eyes widen. "Not because you deserve it. You don't. But because I deserve peace. I've spent too many years carrying your cruelty around like a weight. I'm putting it down now. You don't get to take up any more space in my life. Not my thoughts, not my energy, nothing. I'm done." I stood to leave, and Richard's hand twitched toward me, though he was too weak to reach. "Margaret," he whispered. "Margaret would be so proud of you." I paused at the door and looked back at him one last time. "I know," I said simply. "Goodbye, Richard." I walked out of that hospice room and didn't look back. Susan didn't follow me. I drove straight to the airport and flew home to Boston. And I didn't cry. I felt lighter, cleaner, like I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for 30 years. Richard died 3 days later. Susan called to tell me, her voice flat and exhausted. "The funeral is Thursday. I don't expect you to come." "I won't," I said, "but I'll send flowers." I sent white roses, Margaret's favorite, with a card that read simply, "Rest now." I didn't attend the funeral. That chapter was closed. Richard and Susan had been parts of my story, but they didn't get to be part of my future. With Richard gone, Emily's past was finally buried. But her future was just beginning, because 10 years after that wedding, she was about to open something extraordinary. 10 years after the wedding that destroyed my family and rebuilt my life, I stood in front of a renovated historic building in downtown Dallas, watching as workers hung the final sign above the entrance. The letters were elegant and simple, "Margaret's Kitchen." Below them in smaller script, "She cooked with love, we serve with honor." This was the 50th location, the flagship of what had become a national movement. Margaret's Kitchen wasn't a typical restaurant. Each location offered free meals to foster children, adopted youth, and families struggling to make ends meet. They provided job training for people rebuilding their lives after incarceration, addiction, or abuse. They hosted support groups and workshops in community spaces designed to feel like home. The restaurants were funded entirely by the Margaret Trust's profits, and every single employee was someone who understood what it meant to start over, to rebuild from nothing, to find dignity after being told you had none. Inside the Dallas flagship was exactly what I'd envisioned. The kitchen was completely visible from the dining room, separated only by glass walls, a deliberate statement about transparency and inclusion. No one would ever be hidden in the kitchen again. The walls displayed photographs of Margaret in her garden, Margaret at her desk, Margaret holding me as a baby. Beneath each photo was a quote, "Everyone deserves dignity. Second chances change the world. You are not defined by who left you, but by who you choose to become." The grand opening had drawn hundreds of people, foster youth we'd helped through scholarships, families who'd received support, community leaders, journalists, and people who'd simply been moved by the documentary and wanted to see what we'd built. I stood near the entrance, greeting guests, my heart so full it almost hurt. Caroline appeared beside me as the crowd settled in for the speeches. She was 40 now, her face lined in ways that spoke of hard-won wisdom rather than easy beauty. She'd been sober for 8 years, had earned her degree in social work while working full-time at the Margaret Trust, and had become the Director of Community Programs, a title she'd earned through years of dedication, not handed to her because of her last name. "Are you ready?" I asked her. She nodded, though I could see her hands trembling. "I've been practicing for weeks." Caroline took the podium first. The room quieted, and I saw some people lean forward, curious about the woman who'd once been Kitchen Caroline, the viral villain who'd become a symbol of cruelty. 10 years ago, Caroline began, her voice stronger than I expected. "I said something unforgivable. I told my sister that adopted kids sit in the kitchen, that the table was for real family. I was wrong. So completely, devastatingly wrong." She paused, tears already starting. "Today, I'm honored to say this kitchen is where queens are born. This kitchen is where healing happens, where people learn they matter, where no one is ever made to feel small or unwanted or less than. And I'm grateful every single day that my sister gave me the chance to be part of it, to help build this instead of continuing to destroy things. Thank you, Emily, for everything." The applause was genuine, warm. People stood. Caroline stepped down from the podium, and I took her place, looking out at faces that represented every kind of pain and resilience imaginable. "They told me I didn't belong," I said, my voice steady. "They told me I should be grateful just to have a place at the table, that I should accept whatever scraps they decided to give me." I smiled, feeling Margaret's presence like a hand on my shoulder. "But my grandmother taught me something different. She taught me that you don't beg for a seat at someone else's table. You build a table big enough for everyone." I gestured to the restaurant around us, to the visible kitchen, to the people filling every seat. "This is my table. This is our table. And everyone, every single person, regardless of where they came from, or what they've survived, or who told them they weren't good enough, everyone is welcome here." The room erupted. People were crying, cheering, standing. I saw foster kids who'd received scholarships, saw mothers who'd gotten jobs through our training programs, saw Caroline openly weeping in the front row. Our eyes met, and we both nodded a moment of understanding that needed no words. As the celebration continued, Emily stepped outside for air. And there in the garden she'd restored, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, home. I slipped out through the kitchen's back door, needing a moment alone before the evening's festivities continued. The garden behind Margaret's kitchen had been designed as a perfect replica of the one at the estate, the one where Margaret had taught me everything that mattered. Roses bloomed in careful rows, their colors ranging from deep crimson to soft blush pink. The pathways were swept clean, lined with lavender and rosemary that released their fragrance when brushed. And at the center, on the restored stone bench, sat a bronze statue of Margaret. The sculptor had captured her perfectly, not as the frail woman she'd been at the end, but as I remembered her from childhood. Strong, certain, with her hands resting in her lap, and her arms slightly open as if inviting someone to sit beside her. The plaque at the base read, "Margaret Eleanor Crawford, she believed in second chances." I sat down next to the statue, close enough that our shoulders would have touched if she were real. The bronze was still warm from the afternoon sun. "I did it, Grandma," I said aloud, not caring if anyone heard. "I chose grace. It was hard. God, it was so hard. Some days I wanted to burn it all down to make them suffer the way they made me suffer. But I remembered what you said, forgiveness is the only real power. You were right." I laughed softly, thinking about how stubborn she'd been, how certain of her convictions. "You always were right, even when I didn't want to hear it." The garden was peaceful in the golden hour light, and I let myself reflect on the journey that had brought me here. 10 years ago, I'd been that woman walking out of Caroline's wedding reception, watching their world collapse behind me. I'd felt powerful in that moment, triumphant even. But I'd also felt hollow, like I'd won a war, but lost something essential in the process. Now I was sitting in a garden dedicated to second chances at the grand opening of the 50th restaurant in a chain that fed thousands of people every day. Caroline was inside, sober and purposeful, helping others rebuild their lives the way I'd helped her rebuild hers. Daniel came every Saturday to volunteer in the kitchen, bringing his wife and their 2 daughters to teach them about service and compassion. Helen Whitmore sat on the board of the Margaret Trust and had become one of my closest friends. Thousands of young people had received scholarships. Hundreds had found jobs through our training programs. The documentary had sparked conversations that led to policy changes protecting foster children in 3 states. This is what revenge looks like when you choose grace, I thought. Not destruction, but creation. Not tearing down, but building up. Not making them small, but making everyone else feel big. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I felt a warmth wash over me, not supernatural, nothing mystical, just a deep sense of peace that I'd been searching for my entire life. It felt like coming home after a long journey, like finally understanding a truth that had been waiting for me all along. I closed my eyes and imagined Margaret's voice the way she used to sound when we sat in her garden and she taught me about resilience and grace. "You were always magnificent, sweet girl. I'm so proud of you." "Thank you," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Thank you for teaching me that I was enough even when the world told me I wasn't. Thank you for leaving me the tools to build this." I opened my eyes and looked at the statue beside me, at the bronze face that would never age, never change, never leave me again. I'll make sure no one else ever feels the way I did. That's my promise to you. Every kid who walks through those doors will know they belong. They'll know they matter. They'll know they're enough, exactly as they are. The back door opened, and Caroline appeared silhouetted against the kitchen's warm light. "Emily, they're asking for you. The youth scholarship recipients want to say thank you." I stood brushing off my dress and took one last look at the garden. "I'm coming." As I walked back toward the light and warmth of Margaret's kitchen, toward the people waiting inside, who'd been given second chances, just like I had, I felt something I'd spent 30 years searching for. Not revenge, not vindication, not even forgiveness, though that had come too. Just peace. Emily stood and walked back inside where her team was waiting. There were more kitchens to build, more lives to change. And she was just getting started. 5 years after opening the flagship Margaret's Kitchen, the movement had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. 150 locations now operated across the United States, from Seattle to Miami, from Portland to Charleston. The Margaret Trust had provided scholarships to over 10,000 foster and adopted youth, many of whom now worked in our restaurants or had gone on to build their own businesses and organizations. Time magazine put me on their 100 most influential people list, though I declined the photo shoot and the gala. Harvard Business School taught a case study called Emily Crawford and Transformational Leadership that analyzed how pain could be converted into purpose. I was invited to speak at conferences and summits, though I turned down most of them, preferring to let the work speak for itself. Caroline had become something I never expected: a nationally recognized voice for mental health and addiction recovery. She'd written a memoir titled The Kitchen Table: How My Sister Saved Me from Myself that had spent 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Every penny of proceeds went to the Margaret Trust. She traveled the country giving talks at high schools and universities, speaking with raw honesty about cruelty, accountability, and the possibility of redemption. She'd remarried 3 years ago to a social worker named Michael, who knew her entire history and loved her not despite it, but because of who she'd become because of it. Last year they'd had a daughter. They named her Margaret. On the 15th anniversary of Margaret's death, Caroline and I met at the original estate garden. It had been transformed into the administrative headquarters for the scholarship program, just as I'd promised myself years ago. Young people came here for interviews, for workshops, for moments of peace in Margaret's restored sanctuary. We walked together to the center of the garden, carrying a new rose bush to plant beside Margaret's memorial. Caroline knelt in the dirt without hesitation, her hands sure as she dug. "I used to hate this place," she said quietly. "Every memory here reminded me of how jealous I was, how small I felt. Now it's the only place I feel close to her." I knelt beside her, helping guide the rose into the earth. "She's not just here. She's in every kitchen we build, every scholarship we give, every person who finds their way back from the edge. She's everywhere." We sat on the restored bench afterward, not speaking, just being. We weren't quite sisters, too much had happened for that simple word to fit. But we were something deeper. 2 women shaped by the same pain who'd chosen different paths through it, and somehow ended up building something beautiful together. The documentary continued to ripple outward. The Kitchen Girl was now required viewing in social work programs across the country and had been screened in foster care agencies in all 50 states. It had sparked policy changes in 7 states, strengthening protections for adopted and foster children against family discrimination and abuse. My inbox still filled daily with messages. A woman who'd left her abusive adoptive family after seeing the film. A man who'd reconciled with the sister who'd treated him as lesser their entire childhood. A foster youth who'd applied for our scholarship and was now in medical school. I read every letter I could. Some made me cry. Some made me smile. But all of them reminded me that my pain hadn't been meaningless. It had been transformed into something that helped others survive their own. And on quiet nights, when Emily sits in her home overlooking Boston Harbor, she opens the wooden box that holds Margaret's letter and reads it one more time. Tonight, in my study overlooking Boston Harbor, I opened the wooden box one more time. I was 45 years old now, and Margaret's letter had been read so many times the creases were worn thin, the ink slightly faded in places where my tears had fallen over the years. I unfolded it carefully and read the words I knew by heart. Forgiveness is the only real power. Revenge is easy. Grace is hard. But grace, true grace, changes the world. I believe in you, my darling. Choose wisely. I folded the letter with the same reverence I always did and placed it back in the box beside my father's photographs, beside Maria's letter, beside the first scholarship application we ever approved. I chose wisely, Grandma, I whispered to the empty room. I looked around at the life I'd built. Not the corner office or the accolades or the magazine profiles, but the real substance of it. A company that served people instead of exploiting them. A mission that had touched thousands of lives. A relationship with Caroline that, while it would never be simple, was honest and rooted in mutual growth. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one sitting at that kitchen table, desperate for someone to notice her, willing to make herself smaller just to avoid being pushed out entirely. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that you don't beg for belonging. You create it. You build your own table and make it big enough for everyone who's ever felt unwanted. My phone rang, breaking the silence. The caller ID showed a number I recognized: Sofia Martinez, one of our scholarship recipients. Emily. Her voice was breathless, shaking with emotion. I got into medical school, full scholarship. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm actually going to be a doctor. Tears sprang to my eyes. Sophia had been in foster care until she aged out at 18, had worked 2 jobs while finishing community college, had applied to our scholarship program with an essay that made me cry. Sophia, I'm so proud of you, so incredibly proud. I never thought I'd make it this far, she sobbed. Everyone told me girls like me don't become doctors, that I should be realistic. Well, you proved them wrong, I said, smiling through my own tears. Your grandmother would be so proud too. Sophia's grandmother had raised her until passing away when Sophia was 12, the event that eventually led to her entering the system. I'd heard so many stories about that woman's strength and love. Thank you, Sophia whispered. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Thank you for proving what I always knew, I replied. You were always enough, Sophia. You always were. After we hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights reflecting off the dark water. I thought about Richard and Susan, about Caroline at that wedding, about everyone who'd ever made me feel like I was less than. I thought about the kitchen table, the humiliation, the years of being told I should be grateful for scraps. And I smiled. Not with bitterness or lingering pain, but with genuine peace. They'd tried to hide me in the kitchen, to make me invisible, to convince me I didn't belong. But that kitchen became the foundation of everything I built. That's where I learned that nourishment comes in many forms. That's where I discovered that feeding people physically, emotionally, spiritually is one of the most powerful things you can do. I spoke aloud to the window, to the night, to anyone who'd ever felt like I once did. They told me adopted kids sit in the kitchen. So I built a kitchen where everyone belongs, and I never sat in the back again. Because the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something so beautiful they beg to be part of it. And when they do, you let them in, not as an act of weakness, but as the ultimate act of strength. And that's where Emily's story ends, or perhaps where it truly begins. Because 15 years after that wedding, she's not defined by what was done to her, but by what she chose to build from the ashes. If Emily's journey resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been told you don't belong, I want you to know you are enough, exactly as you are. Your past doesn't define your future. Your pain can become your purpose. And sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let cruelty make you cruel. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced family rejection or felt like an outsider in your own home? How did you find your way through it? What does building your own table mean to you? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story moved you, if Emily's choice of grace over revenge inspired you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, we share true stories of resilience, redemption, and the extraordinary strength of ordinary people who refuse to let their circumstances define them. Stories like Emily's remind us that we're not alone, that transformation is possible, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose to be kind when you have every right to be cruel. Thank you for listening to Emily's story. Thank you for being here. And remember, you don't need permission to belong. You just need the courage to build your own table. Until next time, choose grace. I was 28 years old the day my sister told me I belonged in the kitchen. Not because I was a woman, because I was adopted. It was her wedding day. 200 guests, crystal chandeliers, a $45,000 dress. Caroline had everything she ever wanted. Except she wanted one more thing to remind me I'd never be real family. "Adopted kids eat in the kitchen," she announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "This table's for real family." My parents laughed. The room went silent. Everyone waited to see if I'd cry. I didn't. I smiled, pulled out my phone, and typed 6 words that would destroy them. Cancel the contract. Execute protocol. $50 million vanished in 30 seconds. My sister's face went from smug to horrified. My mother turned white. My father started shouting, but I was already walking toward the exit. You see, what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I wasn't just the adopted daughter they'd spent 20 years humiliating. I was the granddaughter of the woman who built their empire, the real heir they'd lied about, the majority shareholder they'd tried to erase. And for 10 years, I'd been planning this exact moment. They thought they could hide me in the kitchen. They were wrong. By the end of this story, my sister would lose everything. My parents would beg for mercy. And I would have to choose between the revenge I'd earned and the grace my grandmother believed I was capable of. This is the story of how one sentence at a wedding cost them an empire. And it starts with me walking out that door. My name is Emily Crawford. Emily. I'm 28 years old, and until 3 hours ago, most people in Dallas high society knew me as 2 things: the adopted daughter of the Crawford family and a rising business consultant who'd made a small fortune turning around failing companies in Boston. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the last 10 years preparing for this exact moment, my sister's wedding day. The Four Seasons ballroom was everything Caroline had ever dreamed of. I stood in the marble entryway watching the final preparations unfold like a perfectly choreographed ballet. 10,000 white roses cascaded from ceiling installations, their petals so pristine they looked artificial. 3 crystal chandeliers, each one worth more than most people's houses, cast prismatic light across tables draped in ivory silk. A 12-piece orchestra tuned their instruments near a stage that could have hosted a presidential inauguration. Ice sculptures shaped like swans guarded a champagne tower that must have cost $5,000 alone. 200 guests milled about in designer gowns and custom tuxedos. I recognized most of them: oil executives, real estate moguls, the lieutenant governor, and at least 3 families who'd made their fortunes before Texas was even a state. This was Caroline's triumph, her coronation, the day she married Daniel Hartley and secured her place among Dallas royalty. I'd chosen my dress carefully that morning, a simple navy sheath, elegant but understated. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would make anyone remember I was there. My only jewelry was the vintage gold watch my grandmother had given me when I was 8 years old. I touched it now, feeling its familiar weight against my wrist, and thought of her words, "Keep this with you always. It will protect you when I'm gone." Grandma Margaret had been gone for 10 years, but she was about to protect me one last time. I made my way through the crowd, smiling politely at people who'd known me since childhood, but whose eyes slid past me as if I were part of the furniture. That was nothing new. I'd been invisible in this family my entire life, the adopted daughter, the charity case, the one who should be grateful just to have a seat at the table. The seating chart was displayed on an enormous gilded easel near the ballroom entrance. I scanned the names, already knowing what I'd find. Table 1. Richard and Susan Crawford, parents of the bride. Table 2, the Hartley family. Tables 3 through 10. Various dignitaries, business partners, and Caroline's sorority sisters. I kept reading. Table 15, Table 16, Table 17, Table 18. There it was. My name printed in the same elegant calligraphy as everyone else's, but positioned on a table so far from the main action it might as well have been in a different zip code. Ms. Crawford. A young woman in a headset appeared at my elbow, her smile bright but her eyes nervous. She was one of the wedding planners, probably in her early 20s, and she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "I can show you to your seat if you'd like." "Thank you." I followed her through the ballroom, weaving between tables as the crowd thickened. We walked past the head table, past the tables draped in slightly nicer linens, past the tables with the better view of the stage. We kept walking. And walking. Table 18 was positioned directly next to the kitchen entrance. I could hear the catering staff shouting orders through the swinging doors. The table itself was smaller than the others, wedged into a corner where servers would have to squeeze past every time they brought out a new course. 5 other people were already seated. A distant cousin I'd met once at a funeral, an elderly man I didn't recognize, and 3 others who looked equally confused about why they'd been relegated to social Siberia. I sat down without a word. My hands were trembling slightly, not from hurt, but from anticipation. Everything was going exactly as I'd expected. The ceremony had been beautiful in that impersonal, expensive way that Caroline preferred. She'd glided down the aisle in a $45,000 Vera Wang gown, her smile radiant, her eyes sweeping over the crowd to make sure everyone was watching. Daniel had looked handsome and slightly nervous at the altar. I'd watched from my seat in the very last row tucked behind a marble column and thought about all the ways this day was about to go wrong for them. Now, in the reception, I waited. Dinner was served, filet mignon that I barely tasted. Toasts were given, I didn't listen. The first dance happened, then the father-daughter dance, then the general dancing began. Caroline worked the room like a politician, stopping at each table to accept congratulations, pose for photos, and bask in the attention she'd craved her entire life. It took her 45 minutes to reach table 18. By then she'd had 3 glasses of champagne, and her cheeks were flushed with happiness and alcohol. She was surrounded by her bridesmaids, 4 women in pale pink who'd been her sorority sisters at SMU. They were all laughing at something, their voices carrying over the music. I stood as she approached, smoothing my dress. "Caroline, congratulations. You look beautiful." She turned, and for a moment I saw genuine surprise in her eyes, as if she'd genuinely forgotten I was here. Then the surprise melted into something else. Something cruel. "Oh, Emily." She laughed loud and bright. "Didn't you see the seating chart? I had it specially arranged." She gestured toward table 18 with a sweep of her hand, making sure her bridesmaids were paying attention. "Adopted kids eat in the kitchen. This table's for real family only." The words hung in the air. Several people at nearby tables turned to look. One of her bridesmaids gasped, then tried to cover it with a cough. I could see my parents at the head table 20 feet away. My father, Richard Crawford, was chuckling into his wine glass. My mother, Susan, smiled and shook her head as if Caroline had made a slightly inappropriate but ultimately harmless joke. No one defended me. No one said a word. The room didn't go silent, not exactly. But there was a pause, a collective held breath as people waited to see what I would do. Would I cry? Would I make a scene? Would I slink away in shame? I did none of those things. Instead, I smiled. A real smile, calm and cold and final. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. My fingers moved across the screen with absolute certainty, typing a message I'd composed in my head 1,000 times. Cancel the contract, execute protocol. I hit send. Then I looked up at Caroline, still smiling. "You're right. I should go." I stood, smoothed my dress one final time, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I heard confused murmurs starting to ripple through the crowd. Someone's phone buzzed. Then another. Then several at once. I didn't look back. I'd waited 20 years for this moment, and I wasn't going to waste it watching their faces as their world collapsed. That text message would cost them everything. But to understand why we need to go back 20 years to the day I discovered I wasn't who they told me I was. My earliest memory is of Caroline's 5th birthday party. I was 5'2", which meant we were born only 3 months apart, though no one ever treated us like we were the same age. Caroline's party was held on the sprawling back lawn of the Crawford estate, under a white tent large enough to house a circus. There were ponies, real Shetland ponies with braided manes that children could ride in circles around the garden. A magician performed tricks with doves and scarves. A face painter transformed little girls into butterflies and princesses. The cake was 3 tiers tall, decorated with fondant flowers that looked too beautiful to eat. And when Caroline blew out her candles, everyone sang so loudly I had to cover my ears. I watched from the kitchen window, my face pressed against the glass. I wasn't at the party. I was inside with Maria, the housekeeper, who'd given me a sugar cookie and told me to stay out of the way. I didn't understand why I couldn't go outside with the other children. I didn't understand why my name hadn't been on any of the invitations, even though I lived in the same house as the birthday girl. When I asked my mother about it later, she looked at me with that expression I would come to know so well. Not quite annoyed, not quite guilty, but somewhere in between. Caroline's birthday is in March, sweetheart. Yours is in June. You'll have your turn. But June came and went. On my actual birthday, my mother was in Houston for a charity luncheon. My father was at the office. Caroline had a playdate with friends from her kindergarten class. No one remembered until a week later when my mother came home with a grocery store cake, the kind with waxy frosting and a plastic flower on top. She'd written, "Happy Birthday, Emma," in blue icing before realizing her mistake and trying to squeeze a "Eily" at the end. The frosting was smeared and uneven. "Better late than never," she said, setting it on the kitchen counter. We ate slices standing up. There were no candles, no song, just my mother checking her watch and mentioning she had a tennis lesson in 20 minutes. That was the pattern of my childhood. Caroline's life was lived in full color in the spotlight with everyone watching and applauding. Mine was lived in the margins, in the spaces between other people's important moments in shades of gray that no one bothered to notice. Caroline got new clothes from Neiman Marcus every season. I wore her hand-me-downs dresses that were already out of style by the time they were passed down to me, shoes that had been broken in by someone else's feet. When I was 7, I asked why I couldn't have something new just once. My mother sighed like I'd asked for the moon. "Emily, you need to be grateful for what you have. Do you know how lucky you are? Some children don't have anything at all." The family photos told the same story. Our formal portraits hung in the main hallway, massive frames in gilt and silver, professionally lit and retouched. In every single one, Caroline was centered, positioned slightly in front of everyone else. My parents stood behind her like proud sentinels. And I was there too, barely visible at the edge of the frame, sometimes partially cropped out, always slightly out of focus. In our Christmas card photo from when I was 9, I wasn't included at all. When I asked why, my father said the photographer had recommended a cleaner composition. I learned what I was when I was 7 years old. My second-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was having us make family trees as an art project. We were supposed to draw ourselves at the bottom, then our parents above us, then our grandparents above them. I'd drawn careful branches in brown crayon labeling each person with their name in my best handwriting. Mrs. Henderson stopped at my desk and studied my drawing for a long moment. Then she knelt down beside me, her voice gentle but pitying. "Emily, sweetheart, did your parents explain to you about your family situation?" I stared at her confused. "What situation?" That evening, my parents sat me down in my father's study. The room smelled like leather and cigar smoke. My mother perched on the edge of a chair, her hands folded in her lap. My father stood by the window, not quite looking at me. "We think you're old enough to understand the truth," my mother began. "You're adopted, Emily. We took you in when you were just a baby. You came from a bad situation, and we gave you a home. We gave you opportunities. We gave you a family." The word adopted didn't mean much to me then, but the way they said it like it was something shameful, something that needed to be explained, that I understood perfectly. "You should be grateful we took you in," my father added, still looking out the window. "Not every child is so lucky." After that, it became the defining fact of my existence. Teachers knew. Other parents knew. Caroline's friends knew. And Caroline made sure I never forgot it. "You're not my real sister," she'd say when we fought over toys or television channels. "My parents just felt sorry for you." When I was 10, she told her entire 5th grade class that my real parents were probably drug addicts who didn't want me. I came home crying that day, and my mother sighed like I'd inconvenienced her. "Caroline shouldn't have said that, but you need to develop a thicker skin, Emily. The world isn't always kind." The only person who made me feel like I belonged was Grandma Margaret. She lived in the west wing of the estate, in a suite of rooms filled with books and antiques and the scent of roses from her garden. While my parents barely noticed me, and Caroline treated me like a servant, Grandma Margaret looked at me like I was precious. She started inviting me to her rooms when I was 6 years old. We'd have tea parties with real china, and she'd teach me things: how to read chapter books years above my grade level, how to identify plants in the garden, how to play chess and think 3 moves ahead. She never talked down to me or made me feel small. She called me my Emily and my clever girl, and when she looked at me, I felt like I mattered. "You're so much smarter than you give yourself credit for," she'd say, tapping my forehead gently with one finger. "Never forget that, Emily, no matter what anyone else tells you." But even Grandma Margaret had a sadness in her eyes sometimes. I'd catch her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between love and regret, like she wanted to tell me something but couldn't find the words. When I asked her why she looked sad, she'd smile and say, "Just thinking about the past, sweetheart. Old people do that." The day my world truly shattered, I was 12 years old. I'd come home early from school with a fever, and the house was quiet. I was heading upstairs to my room when I heard my father's voice coming from his study. The door was cracked open, and he was on the phone, his voice low but clear. "Yes, we kept her," Margaret insisted. "It was part of the arrangement." There was a pause, then a bitter laugh. I know. But what choice did we have? Margaret controls the company. She made it clear that if we didn't raise the girl, we'd be out. So we did what we had to do." Another pause. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding. "It's not like she's really ours anyway. She's just a burden we have to carry until Margaret's gone. After that..." His voice dropped even lower. "After that, we'll handle it. Caroline is our real daughter. She's the one who matters." I don't remember walking up the stairs to my room. I don't remember closing the door or climbing into bed. What I remember is lying there in the dark, my fever making everything feel surreal and distant, and understanding with perfect clarity that I was nothing to these people. Not a daughter, not even a person. Just an obligation, a burden. Something to be handled once the person who cared about me was dead. That day, something inside me went cold and hard. I stopped crying when Caroline was cruel. I stopped hoping my parents would notice me or love me. I built walls around my heart thick and high, and I made myself a promise I would never let them see me break. I would survive this. And someday, somehow I would make them understand what they'd done. But Grandma Margaret was watching everything, and she was making plans. Grandma Margaret's garden became my sanctuary after that day in the hallway. While the rest of the Crawford estate felt cold and hostile, her section of the grounds was alive with color and warmth. Roses climbed the stone walls. Herbs grew in neat rows and vegetables flourished in raised beds that Margaret tended herself despite having a team of gardeners at her disposal. She said she preferred to do the work with her own hands, that it kept her grounded and sharp. I was 10 years old when she started teaching me about business, though I didn't realize that's what she was doing at the time. We'd be kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, and she'd say things like, "You see how the tomatoes need the right support structure to grow. That's just like a supply chain. Every part depends on every other part. If one stake fails, the whole plant collapses. Or we'd be harvesting lettuce, and she'd explain, "You can't take all the leaves at once, Emily. You have to leave some so the plant can regenerate. That's sustainable business. If you drain all the resources now, there's nothing left for tomorrow." She made everything into a lesson, but never in a way that felt like school. During our tea parties in her sitting room, we'd draw up elaborate contracts on fancy stationery. I'd agree to help her deadhead roses in exchange for an extra cookie. She'd negotiate for my assistance, organizing her books in return for a new novel. Then she'd review each contract with me, pointing out terms and conditions, explaining what made an agreement fair versus exploitative. "Always read what you're signing, my clever girl," she'd say, "and never agree to terms that diminish your worth." By the time I was 12, she was showing me actual financial statements from Margaret Industries, though she called them household budgets, in case anyone asked. She'd spread the papers across her desk and walk me through profit margins, operating expenses, asset depreciation. Most of it went over my head initially, but she was patient explaining each concept until I understood. "A woman must always control her own destiny, Emily." She told me more than once, "Never depend on anyone's mercy. The moment you need their permission to survive, you've already lost." I absorbed everything she taught me, like a sponge hungry for the attention and the knowledge both. In her rooms, I wasn't the adopted burden. I was a student, a protege, someone worth investing in. But even as she taught me, I noticed strange things she'd say, comments that didn't quite make sense. Once, when I was studying particularly hard on a math problem, she touched my cheek and said, "You have your father's eyes, you know. So focused, so determined. He could look at a problem and see solutions no one else could imagine." I'd glanced up, confused. "My father? You mean Richard?" She'd gotten a strange look on her face, then something between pain and regret. "Never mind, sweetheart. Just thinking out loud." Another time when I was maybe 13, I'd overheard my parents talking about how I didn't really belong to the family. I must have looked upset when I came to Margaret's rooms that afternoon, because she pulled me into a hug and whispered fiercely, "They shouldn't have lied to you, sweetheart. But the truth will come when you're ready. I promise you that." "Lied about what?" I'd asked, but she just shook her head. "One day you'll understand everything. And when you do, you'll know exactly who you are." The strangest comment came when I was 14 during one of our chess games. I'd just executed a complicated strategy she'd taught me, one that sacrificed a knight to gain positional advantage. She'd smiled with such pride and said, "You're more Crawford than any of them realize." I'd laughed it off as her being sweet, trying to make me feel included. The Crawford name was attached to everything in Dallas, the company, the charitable foundation buildings and streets and scholarships. But it wasn't my name, not really. I was Emily Crawford, only because Richard and Susan had given me their surname when they adopted me. I wasn't a real Crawford, no matter what Grandma Margaret said to make me feel better. On my 8th birthday, Margaret gave me the watch. It was vintage gold with a delicate face and Roman numerals. The band was worn but beautiful, and it fit my small wrist perfectly. "This belonged to someone very special to me," she said as she fastened the clasp. "I want you to have it now. Keep this with you always, Emily. It will protect you when I'm gone." I'd been young enough to take her literally. "Will it protect me like a shield?" She'd smiled, that sad smile I'd seen so often. "Something like that. Just promise me you'll never take it off." I promised. And I kept that promise. Even now at 28, the watch was on my wrist, ticking steadily against my pulse. That same year, Margaret took me on a tour of the house, pointing out small brass plaques mounted near doorways and in corners. "Audio-video recording in use for security purposes," they read. There must have been 20 of them throughout the estate. "The house has recording devices everywhere," Margaret explained casually, as if she were pointing out light switches. "It's for security. You see the signs? Yes, Texas law says we have to post notice. Most people never pay attention to them, but they're there." I'd nodded, not thinking much of it. Rich people had security systems. That seemed normal. "Just remember," she'd added, her voice taking on a weight I didn't understand then, "everything said in this house is documented. Every conversation, every word, nothing is ever truly private. At the time, I'd found it slightly creepy, but ultimately unimportant. It would be years before I understood what she was really telling me. The last real conversation I had with Margaret was 3 months before she died. I was 17, stressed about college applications, and trying to figure out how I'd afford tuition. My parents had made it clear they'd pay for Caroline's education at SMU, but expected me to find my own way through scholarships and loans. Margaret called me into her study one evening. The sun was setting through the windows, casting golden light across her desk and the photographs that lined the shelves. She looked frailer than I'd ever seen her, and something in her eyes told me this conversation mattered. "Sit down, my darling," she said, patting the chair beside her. "I need to tell you something important." I sat, and she took my hands in hers. Her skin was paper-thin and cool. "When I'm gone," she began, and I tried to protest, but she squeezed my hands to silence me. "Hush. When I'm gone, you're going to face some very difficult choices. People are going to hurt you, betray you, try to take things that belong to you, and you're going to want revenge. That's natural. That's human." I didn't understand what she meant, but I listened. "But I want you to remember something," she continued. "Forgiveness is the only real power. Revenge is easy, Emily. Any fool can destroy something. But grace, true grace, that's hard. That takes real strength. And grace, true grace, changes the world." "I don't understand," I whispered. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "You will. One day you'll face a choice between revenge and redemption, between destroying your enemies and offering them a chance to be better. And when that day comes, I want you to choose wisely. Choose the harder path. Choose grace. But what if they don't deserve it?" "They won't," she said simply. "That's what makes it grace." I left that conversation feeling confused and slightly unsettled. 3 months later, Margaret suffered a stroke in her sleep. By the time the housekeeper found her the next morning, she was gone. 6 months later, Margaret died, and the reading of her will would expose the first crack in the family's lies. The funeral had been a spectacle befitting Margaret Crawford's status in Dallas society. 500 people packed the cathedral, and the reception afterward stretched across 3 rooms of the country club. Everyone spoke about her legacy, her business acumen, her charitable works. No one mentioned that she'd been the only person who ever made me feel like I belonged. 2 weeks later, we gathered in the estate library for the reading of the will. The room smelled like old leather and lemon polish, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and heavy curtains that blocked out most of the afternoon light. Attorney Charles Brennan sat behind Margaret's antique desk, a stack of documents in front of him, and reading glasses perched on his nose. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, and distinguished the kind of lawyer who'd handled the Crawford family's affairs for decades. Richard sat in the largest chair, his posture relaxed and confident. Susan perched beside him, her hands folded primly in her lap, though I could see the anticipation in her eyes. Caroline sprawled on the leather sofa, scrolling through her phone with barely concealed impatience. She was 20 at the time, home from SMU for the summer, and she'd already told her sorority sisters that she was about to inherit millions. I'd seen the text messages over her shoulder. I took a seat in the corner in a straight-backed chair near the window. I expected nothing. Margaret had loved me, yes, but love and inheritance were different things. Surely she would leave everything to Richard, her son-in-law, and the CEO of her company. That's how these things worked in families like ours. Attorney Brennan cleared his throat and began reading. The first several items were predictable, specific pieces of jewelry to Susan, a vintage car collection to Richard, various charitable donations to causes Margaret had supported. Caroline received a trust fund that would pay out gradually until she turned 30. She rolled her eyes at the restrictions but didn't complain. Then Attorney Brennan turned to a new page, and his voice took on a more formal tone. "To my granddaughter, Emily Crawford, I leave the following 60% controlling interest in Margaret Industries, the Crawford estate property, including all buildings and grounds and $5 million in liquid assets held in trust until her 21st birthday. The silence that followed was absolute. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My ears were ringing and I couldn't quite process what I'd just heard. 60%, controlling interest, the estate, $5 million. Richard's face turned a deep mottled purple. He shot to his feet. That's impossible. Charles, there must be some mistake. There is no mistake, Attorney Brennan said calmly, not looking up from the documents. Mrs. Crawford revised her will 8 months ago. She was examined by 2 independent physicians who certified her mental competency. Everything is in order. Susan gasped, her hand flying to her chest. But Emily's not even, she's adopted. She's not blood family. Caroline's reaction was the most visceral. She screamed, actually screamed like someone had stabbed her. She's not even real family. This is insane. Grandma must have been sick, confused. Someone must have manipulated her. Mrs. Crawford was very clear about her wishes. Attorney Brennan interrupted, his voice sharp now. I counseled her multiple times, as did her personal physician. She knew exactly what she was doing and why. The will is legally binding and ironclad. Richard began pacing, his hands clenched into fists. We'll contest it. Obviously, we'll contest it. No court will uphold this travesty. I sat frozen, unable to speak or move. This couldn't be real. Margaret had left me her company, her home, her fortune. Me. The adopted burden they could barely tolerate. Why would she do this? What did she expect me to do with it? The reading continued for another 10 minutes, detailing smaller bequests and administrative matters, but no one was listening. Richard and Susan whispered furiously to each other. Caroline stared at me with pure hatred in her eyes. I felt like I was watching the scene from outside my own body, detached and dreamlike. When it was finally over, Richard, Susan, and Caroline stormed out without another word to me or the attorney. I heard Caroline's voice echoing down the hallway. I'm calling our lawyers right now. This is bullshit. Complete bullshit. Attorney Brennan waited until their footsteps faded, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. My name was written across the front in Margaret's elegant handwriting, for Emily Reed alone. She asked me to give this to you privately, he said, sliding it across the desk. Take your time. I'll wait outside if you need anything. He left, closing the door softly behind him. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of Margaret's personal stationery, covered in her familiar script. My darling Emily, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've just learned that you're not quite as powerless as they've always made you feel. I'm sure you're confused. I'm sure you're frightened. But trust me when I say you've earned every bit of what I've given you, and you're strong enough to handle what comes next. The letter went on to explain what she called her final test. If within 10 years I did not sue, my family did not publicly attack them in court, and offered them a genuine chance to work alongside me in the company, they would receive 30% of the shares. But if I chose what she called pure revenge, legal warfare, public shaming, or outright refusal to reconcile, that 30% would go to charity instead, and the family would almost certainly mount a legal challenge that could tie up everything in court for years. The choice is yours, my darling, Margaret wrote. Revenge or redemption, destruction or grace. I won't tell you which to choose, but I will tell you, this revenge is easy. Any wounded person can lash out. Grace is hard. Grace requires strength that most people never develop. I believe you have that strength. I've been preparing you for this your entire life. When the time comes, choose wisely. Choose the harder path. I believe in you. Always. Grandma. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. She'd known. She'd known exactly what would happen when the will was read. She'd known how they would react, how they would treat me. And she'd set up this impossible test, forcing me to decide who I wanted to be. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment was relentless. Richard and Susan hired a team of lawyers who sent threatening letters daily. They claimed Margaret had been suffering from dementia, that I had manipulated a sick old woman, that the will was clearly the product of undue influence. They demanded I sign over the shares immediately, or face a protracted legal battle that would, as Richard put it, destroy what's left of your pathetic life. Caroline was worse. She cornered me in the hallway one afternoon, her face twisted with rage. She had a copy of the will in her hands, and she tore it to pieces right in front of me, letting the fragments fall to the floor like snow. "You'll regret this, you little parasite," she hissed. "You think you've won. You've won nothing. We'll take everything from you. Everything." I was 18 years old, freshly graduated from high school, and completely overwhelmed. I didn't know anything about running a company. I didn't have allies or resources or any idea how to fight back against their lawyers and their fury. So I made a decision that I knew Margaret would have understood even if she wouldn't have liked it. I signed a temporary management agreement handing operational control of Margaret Industries to Richard for a period of 5 years with the option to extend. I kept my 60% ownership stake, but I gave him the power to make day-to-day decisions. In exchange, he agreed to drop the legal challenges and leave me alone. But I kept the shares, and I kept the letter. And then I disappeared. 3 days after signing the management agreement, I returned to the estate one last time. The house felt emptier than ever, echoing with the absence of the only person who'd ever made it feel like home. Richard and Susan had already moved into the master suite, claiming Margaret's rooms as their own with unseemly haste. Caroline had taken over the east wing, entirely redecorating with her sorority sisters as if the house were already hers. I went to Margaret's study, the one room they hadn't yet touched. Her books still lined the shelves, her reading glasses sat folded on the desk, and the faint scent of her rose perfume lingered in the air. I'd come to say goodbye, to sit in her chair one last time, and remember the woman who'd seen me when no one else had. I ran my fingers along the edge of her desk, that massive antique piece she'd imported from England decades ago. She used to let me sit here when I was small, pretending to do important paperwork while she worked beside me. Once, when I was maybe 9, she'd shown me a secret compartment hidden in the desk's construction. "Every woman needs a place to keep her most precious things," she'd said, pressing a carved rose in the woodwork. A small panel had popped open, revealing a hidden space. I pressed that rose now, not really expecting anything. The panel clicked open and my breath caught. Inside was a wooden box, small and lacquered with brass hinges that had tarnished with age. My hands shook as I lifted it out. The box wasn't locked, though it looked like it should have been. I opened the lid and found myself staring at documents I didn't understand at first. A birth certificate, official and worn at the creases as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. Photographs of a young man with dark hair and eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. And beneath it all, another letter in Margaret's handwriting, this one longer than the first, written on pages that had yellowed slightly with time. I picked up the birth certificate first. The paper felt fragile between my fingers, and the Texas state seal was embossed at the top. I read the words once, then again, then a third time, because my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Name: Emily Margaret Crawford. Date of birth: June 15th. Father: James Michael Crawford, deceased. Mother: blank. James Michael Crawford. I stared at that name, turning it over in my mind. I'd never heard it before, but there was something about it that felt significant, like a word on the tip of your tongue that you can't quite recall. I set down the certificate and picked up the photographs. The young man was maybe 25, photographed in what looked like the 1990s based on his clothing and the quality of the print. He was handsome, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and a smile that seemed almost familiar. And his eyes. His eyes were the same shape as mine, the same unusual shade of gray-green that I'd always thought made me look different from everyone else in the family. My hands were shaking so badly now that I nearly dropped the letter. I unfolded it carefully, and Margaret's handwriting swam before my eyes. "My darling Emily," it began. "If you've found this, it means you've come looking for answers. I'm sorry I couldn't give them to you while I was alive. I told myself I was protecting you, but the truth is, I was protecting myself from the pain of remembering what I'd lost." The letter went on to explain everything, each word like a hammer blow to my chest. James Michael Crawford had been Margaret's only child, her son, the person she'd loved more than anything in the world. He'd died in a car accident when I was 2 years old, and the grief had nearly destroyed her. She couldn't bear to speak. His name, couldn't stand to look at photographs of him, couldn't function as a grandmother to his child because every time she looked at me, she saw him. So she'd created a fiction. She told everyone that James had abandoned a pregnant woman and left behind an illegitimate child, and that she was taking responsibility for his mistake out of duty and shame. She asked Richard and Susan, who were her company managers at the time, to adopt me legally and raise me as their own. In exchange, she gave Richard the CEO position and Susan a place in Dallas society she'd never have achieved otherwise. "I gave them everything," Margaret wrote. "Power, money, status. All I asked was that they love you as their own. But they never did. They resented you from the beginning. You were a reminder of their obligation to me, a burden they carried only because I demanded it. And as the years passed, that resentment turned to cruelty." Chum. I read about how Richard and Susan had their own child, Caroline, and how that had changed everything. Caroline was theirs by blood, theirs by choice, and I became even more of an outsider in a home where I should have belonged. Margaret wrote about watching this happen, seeing the way they treated me, and being paralyzed by her own grief and guilt. "You are a Crawford Emily," the letter continued. "Not by adoption, not by charity, by blood. You are my granddaughter, my only grandchild, the last of my son's legacy. That company was built by my hands, and it should have gone to James. Since he's gone, it belongs to you. It always belonged to you." The final paragraph made my vision blur with tears. "I failed you by hiding the truth. I let you suffer because I was too broken to be strong. But I tried to prepare you. I tried to teach you everything you'd need to survive without me. And now, my darling girl, you know who you are. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? Will you choose revenge, or will you choose to be better than all of us? The choice, as always, is yours." I sat there in her chair, the letter clutched in my hands, and felt something inside me break open. All those years of being called the adopted one. All those moments of exclusion, of being made to feel grateful for scraps of being told I didn't really belong. It was all based on a lie. A lie designed to protect Margaret's broken heart, perpetuated by Richard and Susan's resentment, and used by Caroline as a weapon to make herself feel superior. I wasn't adopted. I was Margaret's granddaughter. The company that Richard now controlled, that Caroline assumed would one day be hers, that Susan spent. Like it was her personal bank account. It was mine. It had always been mine. For the first time since Margaret's death, I cried. I collapsed forward onto her desk and sobbed until my throat was raw and my chest ached. I cried for the little girl who'd watched Caroline's birthday party through a window. I cried for every hand-me-down dress, every cropped photograph, every casual cruelty. I cried for my father James, who I'd never known. And I cried for Margaret, who'd loved me but hadn't been strong enough to tell me the truth. When the tears finally stopped, I felt different. Colder, harder, clearer. Margaret had set up her forgiveness test knowing that one day I'd discover this truth. She'd wanted to see if I could choose grace even after learning that my entire life had been built on lies. She'd wanted me to be better than my pain. I stood up and carefully packed the documents back into the wooden box. I looked around the study one last time, memorizing every detail. Then I spoke aloud to the empty room, to Margaret's ghost, to myself. "I will take back what's mine, but I'll do it the way you taught me. Not with screaming, but with strategy. Not with anger, but with power. They want me to be grateful. They want me to disappear. Fine. I'll disappear. And when I come back, they won't see me coming until it's too late." I packed a single suitcase that night, took the wooden box and Margaret's letters, and left Dallas before sunrise. For 10 years, no one would know where I went, but they would feel my presence. Boston in autumn was nothing like Dallas. The air was crisp and clean, the leaves turned colors I'd only seen in paintings, and nobody knew who I was or where I'd come from. I arrived with a single suitcase, Margaret's wooden box, and $5 million that felt both like a fortune and like blood money. I rented a studio apartment in Cambridge, furnished it with items from IKEA, and enrolled at Harvard Business School using my legal name Emily Crawford. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone. No family dinners where I sat invisible at the corner of the table. No Caroline to remind me of my place. No parents watching me with that mixture of obligation and resentment. Just me, a desk, and a mountain of textbooks that became my new obsession. I studied like someone possessed. While other students socialized and networked at campus bars, I stayed in the library until security kicked me out at midnight. I learned corporate finance, strategic management, mergers, and acquisitions. I studied hostile takeovers and leveraged buyouts until I could recite the mechanics in my sleep. My professors noticed. One of them, Dr. Patricia Chen, pulled me aside after class during my second semester. "You're the best student I've had in 15 years, she said, "but you work like someone running from something. Or toward something." "Both," I replied, and she didn't press further. I graduated at the top of my class at 21. While my classmates celebrated with families and champagne, I accepted a position at Blackstone Private Equity and moved to a slightly larger apartment in Back Bay. The work was brutal 100-hour weeks, impossible deadlines, partners who treated junior associates like disposable resources. But I learned everything I needed to know about how to take apart a company and put it back together. How to find weaknesses in corporate structures. How to identify exactly where power really lived versus where it appeared to live. My colleagues thought I was odd. I never joined them for drinks, never talked about my personal life, never mentioned family or where I'd grown up. One associate, trying to be friendly, asked me once if I was close with my parents. "No," I said simply, and turned back to my spreadsheet. They called me brilliant, but cold behind my back. I didn't care. Cold was exactly what I needed to be. At 23, I left Blackstone and launched EM Consulting. The name was deliberately vague. It could stand for Emily Margaret, or it could just be initials that meant nothing. I started in the same studio apartment where I'd lived as a student, operating off a laptop and a cell phone, taking meetings at coffee shops because I couldn't afford office space. My first client came through a contact I'd made at Harvard, a Texas oil company called Permian Energy, 3 generations old and 2 months from bankruptcy. The grandson running it had made disastrous investments in fracking operations that had never materialized. The company was hemorrhaging money. Creditors were circling, and the family was preparing to lose everything their grandfather had built. I flew to Houston, reviewed their books for 3 days straight, and presented them with a restructuring plan that was ruthless but survivable. Cut half the workforce, sell the unprofitable divisions, renegotiate every contract, focus exclusively on their 3 profitable wells, and rebuild from there. "You're asking us to amputate limbs to save the body," the grandson said. "Yes," I replied, "but you'll have a body left to save." They took my advice. 18 months later, Permian Energy was profitable again. They paid me handsomely and referred me to 3 other struggling family businesses in Texas. Word spread. The consultant from Boston who could save failing companies. The woman who was expensive but worth every penny. By the time I was 26, EM Consulting managed $200 million in assets. Forbes profiled me as the youngest turnaround specialist in America, though I declined to be photographed for the article. I didn't need my face in magazines. I needed credibility, capital, and connections, and I needed to start buying back what was mine. Margaret Industries was a private family-held corporation, which meant it wasn't traded on any public exchange. That made it harder to acquire shares, but it also meant there were no SEC disclosure requirements. No mandatory public filings when someone crossed the 5% ownership threshold. I could buy in secret as long as I was patient and careful. I set up a network of shell companies, LLCs, registered in Delaware and Nevada, each one legally separate, each one controlled by me, through layers of paperwork that would take a forensic accountant months to unravel. Through these companies, I began approaching minor shareholders, people who'd inherited small stakes from dead relatives, retired employees who'd been given shares as bonuses decades ago. I offered fair prices, sometimes slightly above market value, and I never pushed. If someone said no, I thanked them and moved on. Over 5 years, I accumulated 18% of Margaret Industries. Not enough to control anything, not even enough to demand a board seat, but enough to be a problem if I wanted to be. The more important work was recruiting allies. I made a list of everyone Margaret had trusted in business people Richard had pushed aside when he took control. There was Thomas Brennan, the attorney's brother who'd been CFO until Richard forced him out. There was Maria Santos, who'd run operations until Caroline decided she wanted the title, and Maria was retired early. There was David Park, who'd been Margaret's right hand for 20 years before Richard restructured him out of existence. I found each of them, bought them coffee or dinner, listened to their stories of how Richard had marginalized them, stolen their ideas, taken credit for their work. And then I made them an offer, small equity stakes in EM Consulting, in exchange for their proxy votes on any Margaret Industries shares they still held. Most of them had sold their shares years ago, too disgusted to hold on to pieces of what the company had become. But they knew other people. They made introductions. They vouched for me. Slowly, my network grew. The most important ally was Helen Whitmore. She'd been Margaret's closest friend, a pharmaceutical billionaire who'd built her empire the same way Margaret had, through intelligence, determination, and refusing to apologize for her ambition. She owned 8% of Margaret Industries, a stake she'd purchased 40 years ago when she and Margaret were young women building their first companies. I called her office on a Tuesday morning and asked for a meeting. Her assistant tried to screen me, but I mentioned Margaret's name, and within an hour I had an appointment. Helen's office overlooked Boston Harbor, all glass and steel and understated power. She was in her mid-60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, and she looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You look like her," she said finally. "Like Margaret. I see it now." I told her everything. The adoption lie, James's death, Margaret's grief and the bargain she'd made with Richard and Susan, the years of exclusion and cruelty, the truth I'd discovered in the wooden box. Helen's face went from curious to furious. When I finished, she was gripping the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. "Those bastards," she whispered. "Margaret told me she'd adopted her son's illegitimate child. She never told me the truth. She was protecting you even then." "She tried," I said, in her way. Helen stood and walked to her window, staring out at the water. "What do you need from me? Your shares? Your proxy vote, when the time comes?" She turned back to me, and there was something fierce in her expression. "You have it, all of it. And if you need anything else, money connections, lawyers, you call me." With Helen's 8% added to my 18, I controlled 26% of the voting shares. Still not a majority, but enough to be dangerous. And then Richard made the mistake I'd been waiting for. He begged me to come home. I'd been monitoring Margaret Industries from Boston for years, watching through quarterly reports and industry publications as Richard systematically destroyed everything Margaret had built. The first few years after I left the company stayed relatively stable, coasting on the momentum and reputation Margaret had established. But by year 3, cracks started showing. Richard had always fancied himself a visionary, but he lacked Margaret's discipline and judgment. He sunk $15 million into a tech startup that promised to revolutionize oil drilling with artificial intelligence. The startup went bankrupt 18 months later. He invested in a luxury hotel chain that collapsed during the recession. He bought a yacht not for the company, but registered under Margaret Industries as a corporate asset that cost more per month to maintain than most people earned in a year. Caroline was even worse. Richard appointed her chief operating officer when she was 25, fresh out of SMU with a communications degree and zero business experience. She treated the position like an extended vacation with a corporate credit card. I tracked her expenses through contacts I'd maintained at the company. Paris for a marketing conference that was really a shopping trip with her sorority sisters. Milan for vendor meetings at Fashion Week. A $50,000 office renovation because she didn't like the energy of the previous decor. By year 8, Margaret Industries had lost 40% of its value. Major contracts weren't being renewed. Long-time clients were quietly moving to competitors. The company's reputation, once sterling, had become tarnished by missed deadlines and subpar work. I watched it all happen from my office in Boston, my anger growing colder and sharper with each quarterly report. Then in year 10, everything accelerated. A whistleblower. Someone I'd never identified, though I suspected it was one of the old employees Richard had forced out leaked internal documents to the Texas Attorney General. The documents showed that Richard had been falsifying financial reports for at least 3 years, hiding losses, inflating asset values, and transferring company money to personal accounts. The scandal hit the Dallas papers on a Monday morning. By Tuesday, the Attorney General had opened a formal investigation. By Wednesday, 3 major clients had canceled contracts worth a combined $20 million. Banks started making calls about the $30 million in loans. Margaret Industries was carrying loans that were suddenly looking very risky. Caroline's response to the crisis was spectacular in its incompetence. She gave an interview to the Dallas Morning News, apparently thinking she could charm her way out of the disaster. Instead, she blamed disgruntled former employees and people who never understood my grandmother's vision. She implied that the whistleblower was lying, that the financial irregularities were just accounting disagreements, and that everything would be fine once people stopped overreacting. The interview made everything worse. 2 more clients pulled out. The banks demanded immediate meetings, and the Attorney General's office released a statement saying they were treating the investigation as a criminal matter. That's when Richard called me. It was a Thursday evening. I was in my apartment reviewing acquisition documents for a client when my phone rang with a Dallas area code I recognized instantly. I let it ring 4 times before answering. Emily. Richard's voice sounded strained, older than I remembered. I know we haven't spoken in years. I know we had our disagreements. But you're still family, and family helps family in times of crisis. I said nothing, just waited. Margaret loved this company more than anything, he continued. She built it from nothing. She'd want us to save it. I'm asking, no, I'm begging for your help. Come back. Be a consultant. Name your price. Please. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, imagining him squirming on the other end. I have one condition, I finally said. I get full access to all financial records, all board decisions, and complete operational control. I'm not coming back to be a figurehead or to rubber stamp your decisions. If I'm going to fix this, I do it my way. If you refuse, I walk, and you can watch the company collapse. Another pause. I could practically hear him grinding his teeth. Fine. Agreed. I'll be there Monday morning, I said, and hung up before he could respond. I flew into Dallas that weekend and checked into a hotel downtown, avoiding the estate entirely. Sunday night, I laid out my clothes for the next morning, a black Armani suit perfectly tailored, paired with simple heels and minimal jewelry, except for Margaret's watch. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a successful executive who'd built her own empire and didn't need anything from them. Margaret Industries headquarters was a steel and glass building in the business district, 10 stories of prime real estate that Margaret had purchased in the 80s. I arrived at 8:30, 30 minutes before I'd told Richard I'd be there, and walked through the lobby like I owned it. Because legally, I did own 60% of it. The receptionist barely glanced up. Can I help you? Emily Crawford, I have a meeting with Richard. Her eyes widened. She'd clearly heard the stories. Of course. Let me call up. He's expecting you. I took the elevator to the 10th floor where the executive offices were located. The decor was different from what I remembered from the few times Margaret had brought me here as a child. Everything had been updated, made sleeker and more modern, but somehow less warm. Margaret's touches, the art she'd collected, the plants she'd insisted on, were all gone. Richard was waiting in the boardroom with Caroline. He'd aged badly in 10 years. His hair was gray, his face lined with stress, and there was a tremor in his hands that he tried to hide by gripping the edge of the conference table. Caroline looked harder, sharper, her beauty preserved by what I suspected was a small fortune in cosmetic procedures. She wore designer everything dress shoes bag, all probably purchased with company money. "Emily," Richard said, standing. His smile was forced. "Welcome back. You look successful." "I am successful," I replied, not bothering with pleasantries. I set my briefcase on the table and took a seat at the head Margaret's old seat. Caroline's eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing. "I appreciate you coming," Richard continued, still standing awkwardly. "As I mentioned on the phone, we're facing some challenges. You're facing criminal charges for fraud," I interrupted. "The company is $30 million in debt. You've alienated every major client. Your COO gave an interview that made things exponentially worse. These aren't challenges. This is a disaster." Caroline finally spoke, her voice tight. "We wouldn't be in this position if certain people hadn't leaked confidential information." I looked at her directly for the first time. "You wouldn't be in this position if you'd been competent. But we can discuss that later. Right now, I need access to everything. Financial records, contracts, employee files, bank statements. Everything. I'll have my forensic accountant here by tomorrow morning." "That seems extreme," Richard began. "Those were my terms," I said. "Full access or I leave. Your choice." He deflated slightly. "Fine. Caroline will coordinate with your people." "No," I said. "Caroline will not coordinate anything. I don't trust her judgment. I'll work directly with your CFO, assuming you still have one and he hasn't quit yet." Caroline's face flushed red. "You don't get to come in here and—" "Yes, I do." I said, my voice colder than I'd intended. "I get to do exactly that. Because unlike you, I actually know how to run a company. Now sit down and let me work." For a moment, I thought she might storm out. But Richard put a hand on her shoulder and she sank into her chair, glaring at me with pure hatred. "Let's get to work," Richard said weakly. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. "Start from the beginning. Tell me every mistake you've made in the last 10 years. And don't bother lying, I'll find out anyway." Within 2 weeks, Emily discovered something that would change everything. Caroline had committed fraud. And she'd used Emily's name to do it. My forensic accountant was a woman named Rebecca Torres, formerly with the FBI's white-collar crime division, and now one of the most sought-after financial investigators in the country. I'd worked with her on 3 previous cases, and she had a particular talent for finding money that people didn't want found. I brought her to Dallas on my second day back and gave her unrestricted access to Margaret Industries' financial systems. She worked for 10 days straight, barely sleeping, living on coffee, and whatever food I had delivered to the conference room, we'd converted into her temporary office. Stacks of documents covered every surface. Her laptop ran analysis programs through the night. I checked in with her daily, and each time she looked more troubled. On day 11, she called me in and closed the door behind us. "We have a problem," she said, pulling up a file on her screen. "Actually, we have several problems, but this one is different. This one is criminal." She showed me a loan application from First National Bank of Texas dated 3 years prior. The loan was for $2.5 million designated for a marketing and brand development initiative. The application listed Margaret Industries as the corporate borrower with a personal guarantee from Emily M. Crawford, principal shareholder. I stared at the signature line. The handwriting looked similar to mine, the same looping E, the same slant to the letters, but it wasn't quite right. The pressure was different. The rhythm was off. "I never signed this," I said. "I know," Rebecca replied. "I already had it analyzed by a handwriting expert. It's a forgery. A good one, but not good enough. Whoever did this practiced your signature probably from corporate documents where your name appears. But they couldn't quite replicate the muscle memory of how you actually write. She pulled up more documents. Bank statements showing the $2.5 million being transferred into an account I'd never seen before. Wire transfers to luxury goods companies, marketing agencies, designers. And at the center of it all, incorporation papers for a company called Caroline Crawford Lifestyle LLC. The loan funded your sister's attempt to launch a lifestyle brand, Rebecca explained. Designer handbags, clothing accessories. It lasted 8 months before collapsing. The entire $2.5 million is gone. And because you guaranteed the loan, you're technically liable for repayment. I felt a cold fury settling into my bones. Who signed the application internally? Caroline Crawford as COO, and your father countersigned as CEO. So they both knew. Without question, this required multiple levels of approval. They both signed off on a loan application using a forged signature. That's felony forgery, identity theft, and bank fraud. I sat down heavily in one of the chairs. What are my options? Legally, 3. 1. You report this to the FBI immediately. They'll open a criminal investigation. Your sister will likely face charges that carry 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Your father could be charged as an accessory. 2. You confront them privately and demand repayment, though, given the company's financial situation. I'm not sure where they'd get that kind of money. 3. You do nothing for now and use this as leverage later. If I choose option 3, I asked carefully, am I complicit? Rebecca considered this. You have a reasonable time frame to assess your options and decide how to proceed. A few weeks, maybe a month. But if you knowingly help cover this up, if you take active steps to hide the fraud, then yes, you could be seen as an accessory after the fact. The clock starts ticking the moment you become aware of the crime. I looked at the documents again, my mind racing through possibilities. I need copies of everything, multiple sets, stored in different locations. Already done, Rebecca said. Digital copies are in 3 separate secure cloud servers. Physical copies are in a safe deposit box under my name, and I've prepared a sealed affidavit documenting my findings dated today in case anyone later claims you knew about this and did nothing. Thank you. What are you going to do? I'm going to think about it. I called a meeting with Caroline for the next morning, just the 2 of us in the main conference room. I arrived early and arranged the forged documents in a neat stack in the center of the table. Then I sat at the head and waited. Caroline arrived 15 minutes late, carrying a designer coffee cup and scrolling through her phone. She barely glanced at me as she sat down. This better be quick. I have a fitting at 11. I slid the stack of documents across the table. Recognize your work. She looked down at the papers, and I watched the color drain from her face. Her hand reaching for the coffee cup began to tremble. What is this? You know exactly what it is. You forged my signature on a $2.5 million loan application. You committed identity theft and bank fraud. Federal crimes, Caroline. The kind that come with prison time. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Finally, she managed. I was going to tell you. I was going to pay it back. With what money? Your failed handbag company? Or were you planning to embezzle more from the company to cover your tracks? It wasn't like that. The brand was going to be successful. The consultants took your money and told you what you wanted to hear, I interrupted. And when it failed, instead of taking responsibility, you left me holding the bag. Literally. That loan is in my name. I'm liable for it. Caroline's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I panicked. Dad said it would be fine that we'd pay it back before you ever found out. Dad knew. He approved it. He said you'd never notice that you'd signed away operational control anyway, so it didn't matter. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It matters, Caroline. You used my name to commit a felony. I could pick up the phone right now and call the FBI. You'd be arrested before the end of the day. Do you understand that? She was crying openly now, mascara running down her cheeks. Please, Emily, please don't. I'll do anything. I'll fix it. I'll work to pay it back. Just please don't report me. I stood up and gathered the documents, sliding them back into a folder. I'm going to think about what I want to do with this. In the meantime, you're going to do exactly what I tell you. You're going to work harder than you've ever worked in your life to fix this company. You're going to stop spending company money on personal expenses. You're going to stop giving interviews. You're going to be a model employee, and you're going to pray that I decide to be merciful. I walked toward the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. And Caroline, if you warn Dad about this conversation, if you try to destroy evidence, if you do anything that makes this worse, I will bury you. Do we understand each other? She nodded mutely, still crying. I left her there and returned to my temporary office where I locked the documents in my briefcase. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of holding such power over someone who'd spent our entire childhood making me feel powerless. I thought about Margaret's letter, about her plea to choose grace over revenge. But grace didn't mean stupidity. It didn't mean letting Caroline walk away from a felony without consequences. Margaret had said to offer them a chance to see if they were capable of redemption. Fine. I'd offer Caroline a chance to prove that she was exactly as corrupt and irredeemable as I suspected. And when she inevitably proved me right, when she showed that she was incapable of real change or growth, I would use this evidence to destroy her at the moment it would hurt the most. I opened my calendar and noted the date of Caroline's upcoming engagement party. The wedding would follow in about 6 months. That gave me plenty of time to watch and wait to see what kind of person Caroline would choose to be when she thought she was getting away with her crimes. Emily had the weapon. Now she just needed the perfect moment to use it. And that moment was coming soon at Caroline's wedding. I'd been back at Margaret Industries for 6 months, quietly stabilizing the company and documenting every irregularity I found when Caroline burst into the office one Monday morning with news that made Richard actually smile for the first time since I'd returned. I'm engaged, she announced, holding up her left hand to display a diamond that could have funded a small country's education budget. Daniel proposed this weekend in Napa. It was perfect. He's perfect. Everything is perfect. Richard stood and embraced her, something I'd rarely seen him do. That's wonderful news, sweetheart. Daniel Hartley is an excellent match. His family has connections throughout Texas real estate. This could be very good for the company. Susan, who'd flown in from their new condo in Houston for the week, clasped her hands together. Oh, Caroline, I'm so happy for you. When's the wedding? 6 months. Caroline said, her eyes bright with excitement. I want a spring wedding. The 4 seasons, obviously. At least 200 guests. It's going to be the event of the season. I looked up from the financial projections I'd been reviewing. Congratulations, Caroline. I hope you'll be very happy. She glanced at me as if she'd forgotten I was in the room. Thanks, she said coolly, then turned back to her parents. Daniel's taking me to lunch to celebrate. I'll be back this afternoon. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't escape reminders of the engagement. Caroline's social media became a non-stop stream of photos her and Daniel at restaurants, her showing off her ring-posed shots with captions like, "My perfect man," #blessed, #real love, future wife. She treated the office like a wedding planning headquarters, spending more time on seating charts and floral arrangements than actual work. The name Daniel Hartley had sounded familiar when Caroline first mentioned it, but I couldn't immediately place it. Then one evening while reviewing old client files from EM Consulting, I found it. Daniel Hartley, Austin Property Development, 5 years ago. I pulled the file and read through my notes. Daniel had come to me desperate, drowning in debt after a luxury condo project in Austin had collapsed during construction. He'd overextended himself, borrowed heavily, and when the contractors abandoned the project halfway through, he'd been left with a half-built eyesore and $20 million in debt he couldn't service. Banks were calling in loans, Investors were threatening lawsuits. He was 30 days from personal bankruptcy. I'd spent 3 months restructuring his entire financial life. Negotiated with creditors, reorganized his holdings, found a buyer for the failed Austin project who was willing to complete it. By the time I finished, Daniel had kept his reputation intact and still had enough assets to rebuild. He'd signed an NDA as part of the settlement agreement's standard practice to prevent creditors from knowing how desperate his situation had been. He'd sent me a handwritten note afterward, which I'd kept in the file. "You saved my life. I owe you everything. If you ever need anything, call me. I mean that." Daniel. I stared at that note for a long time, thinking about the cosmic joke of Caroline choosing to marry the one man who owed me more than anyone else in Texas. The engagement party was held at the country club, a lavish affair with 100 guests, an open bar, and a string quartet. I debated not attending, but my absence would have raised questions. So I wore a simple black dress, arrived late, and positioned myself near the bar where I could observe without participating. Caroline was in her element, glowing in a white cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She moved through the crowd accepting congratulations, her hand perpetually extended so people could admire her ring. Daniel stayed close to her side, handsome in a dark suit, smiling and shaking hands with people who clearly saw him as Caroline's prize catch. I was nursing a glass of wine when I heard a voice behind me say, "Emily? Emily Crawford?" I turned and found myself face to face with Daniel Hartley. Up close, I could see the recognition dawning in his eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like panic. "Hello, Daniel," I said calmly. "Congratulations on your engagement." He glanced around nervously, as if checking whether anyone was listening. Emily, I had no idea you were related to Caroline. She mentioned she had a sister, but she didn't mention my name." I kept my voice neutral, almost pleasant. "That sounds like Caroline. Life is full of surprises, isn't it?" Before he could respond, Caroline appeared at his side, her eyes narrowing as she looked between us. "Danny, there you are. I've been looking for you." She looked at me with barely concealed suspicion. "What are you two talking about?" "We were just getting reacquainted," I said. "Daniel and I have met before." Caroline's hand tightened on Daniel's arm. "You have... where?" Daniel's face had gone slightly pale. "It was years ago, at a business conference. We were on the same panel about Texas real estate markets. Very brief." I took a sip of my wine, letting him construct his lie. "That's right. Though I remember it being more of a networking mixer than a formal panel." "Right, yes," Daniel said quickly. "A mixer. It was very crowded. We barely spoke." Caroline seemed to relax slightly. "Well, that's nice that you've met. Maybe you can give us some advice about investment properties. Daniel's in real estate development, you know. He's very successful." "I'm aware," I said, my eyes meeting Daniel's. "I'm sure Daniel has built quite an empire for himself." Daniel cleared his throat. "If you'll excuse me, I need to speak with the caterer about something. Caroline, I'll find you in a minute." He practically fled across the room. Caroline watched him go, then turned back to me with a frown. "That was weird. Why did he seem so uncomfortable?" "I have no idea," I lied smoothly. "Maybe he doesn't like talking about work at parties. Congratulations again, Caroline. I hope you'll be very happy together." I walked away before she could respond, moving to the opposite side of the room. I'd been there for about 20 minutes when Daniel found me again, this time without Caroline. "We need to talk," he said quietly, gesturing toward an empty hallway off the main ballroom. I followed him, curious about what he'd say. Once we were alone, he turned to face me, his expression a mixture of guilt and desperation. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to God, Emily, I had no idea you were Caroline's sister. When she told me about her family, she said her sister was adopted and they weren't close. She never mentioned your name. I never made the connection." "It's fine, Daniel. You don't owe me an explanation." "But I do. You saved me. If it weren't for you, I'd have lost everything 5 years ago. I meant what I wrote in that note. I owe you everything." "Does Caroline know?" I asked, Does she know I helped you? He shook his head vigorously. No, the NDA covered all of that. I never told her about Austin, about how bad things got. As far as she knows, I've always been successful. And you'd prefer to keep it that way? Please, he said. I know I have no right to ask, but yes. If Caroline found out I was nearly bankrupt, that I needed someone to save me, I don't know what she'd do. She fell in love with the successful version of me. I don't want her to know about the failure. I studied him for a moment, this man who was about to marry into a family that had spent my entire life making me feel worthless. Your secret is safe with me, Daniel, for now. Enjoy your engagement. Relief flooded his face. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Emily, if there's ever anything I can do, I'll let you know, I said and walked back to the party. I left shortly after claiming an early morning meeting. As I drove back to my hotel, I thought about the pieces falling into place. Caroline's fraud, the forged signature, and now Daniel, the man who owed me his entire career, marrying into the family that had stolen mine. Daniel thought he was marrying into money. He didn't realize he was marrying into a trap. And Emily had just decided to spring it. The months leading up to the wedding became an exercise in watching Caroline reveal exactly who she was. I'd given her a chance after discovering the forged loan documents told her to work hard and prove she was capable of change. Instead, she doubled down on every character flaw she'd ever possessed. 3 months before the wedding, she appeared in my temporary office with a 3-ring binder thick enough to use as a weapon. I need your help with wedding logistics, she announced, dropping it on my desk with a thud. I looked up from the supplier contract I'd been reviewing. What kind of logistics? Just some coordination stuff. Confirming RSVPs, organizing transportation, that sort of thing. You know, assistant-level work. She said it so casually, as if asking me to perform menial tasks were the most natural thing in the world. I opened the binder and flipped through pages of spreadsheets, vendor contracts, and seating arrangements. That's when I saw the seating chart for the reception. Table 1 through Table 17 were clearly labeled with names I recognized. Dallas Elite Business Partners, Caroline's sorority sisters. Then Table 18 positioned in the corner near the kitchen entrance with a list that included distant cousins I'd met once, elderly relatives, who probably wouldn't hear the speeches anyway, and my name, Emily Crawford. Table 18, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Near the kitchen. Caroline leaned over my shoulder, not quite suppressing a smile. Well, you understand. The main tables are for real family and important guests. I didn't think you'd mind being somewhere quieter. You don't really know most of my friends anyway. I looked up at her, watching her face carefully. This was a test, I realized. She was testing to see if I'd object, if I'd make a scene, if I'd give her an excuse to paint me as the difficult, ungrateful adopted sister who couldn't just be happy for her. Of course not, I said evenly. I understand perfectly. She looked almost disappointed that I hadn't fought back. Great. So you'll handle the RSVP confirmations. I need them done by Friday. I'll have my assistant handle it, I replied. I'm not a wedding planner, Caroline. I'm here to fix the company. Her smile tightened. Right. Of course. 2 weeks later, Richard called an impromptu board meeting. He and Caroline arrived with Daniel in tow, all 3 of them carrying matching presentation folders. I knew before they said a word that this was going to be painful. We have an exciting investment opportunity. Richard began pulling up a slide presentation on the conference room screen. Daniel's company is developing a luxury resort in Hill Country, $50 million project, high-end ecotourism wellness center, the works. We'd like Margaret Industries to be the primary investor. I flipped open the folder and started reading while Richard continued his pitch. The numbers were fantasy. The land valuation was inflated by at least 30%. The projected occupancy rates assumed the resort would be operating at near capacity year-round, which was absurd for that market. And the deal structure meant Daniel's development company would take fees at every stage acquisition construction management, regardless of whether the project succeeded. This is a terrible deal, I said, interrupting Richard mid-sentence. Caroline's face flushed. You haven't even looked at it properly. I've seen enough. The land is overvalued, your projections are unrealistic, and the fee structure is designed to benefit Daniel's company, whether the resort succeeds or fails. We'd be taking all the risk while he takes guaranteed payments. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Emily, I understand your concerns, but this project has been vetted by multiple consultants. Consultants you paid, I said. Who told you what you wanted to hear? I've seen this exact structure before. It's designed to extract maximum fees from investors while insulating the developer from any real risk. Richard's voice took on an edge. Daniel is family now. We take care of family. Surely you of all people should understand the importance of family loyalty. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. Family loyalty doesn't mean making bad investments. If you want to give Daniel money, write him a personal check, but I won't sign off on using company funds for this. You might not have a choice, Caroline said coldly. Dad and I control operational decisions. Remember, you signed that agreement. I control 60% of the company, I replied, which means any investment over $10 million requires my approval per the corporate bylaws. Margaret made sure of that. So, no, you don't have a choice here. The meeting ended badly with Caroline storming out and Richard making vague threats about revisiting our management structure. I watched them go and thought about Margaret's recordings, wondering if this conversation was being captured somewhere in the company's security systems. That thought led me to raise the topic at the next board meeting, this one with the full leadership team present. We were discussing a sensitive vendor negotiation when I interrupted. Before we continue, I should mention something for everyone's awareness. As part of the estate security protocols, all conversations in this building and at the main residence are recorded. Audio and video. There are signs posted throughout both properties as required by Texas law. I just want to make sure everyone knows. The room went quiet. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Yes, Margaret installed all that years ago. Those old systems probably don't even work anymore. No one's monitored them in years. Just wanted everyone to be aware, I said pleasantly. For legal purposes. I caught the general counsel's eye across the table. He was new hired after the previous attorney had quit during the fraud scandal. He made a note on his legal pad, and I knew he'd be checking to verify the recording systems were compliant with current regulations. Good. Let him verify they existed and were functional. Let him document it all. Caroline had forgotten or perhaps never knew about Margaret's meticulous documentation system. Richard had dismissed it as obsolete. But I knew better. Margaret had shown me those recording systems when I was a teenager. She'd explained that everything was backed up, encrypted, stored in multiple locations. Nothing disappears, she'd told me. Every conversation, every moment. It's all preserved. I'd been making my own recordings too, of course. Every meeting with Caroline and Richard, every conversation where they revealed their true feelings about me, about Margaret, about their entitlement to everything she'd built. I had hours of material now carefully cataloged and stored in 3 separate secure locations. 2 months before the wedding, I commissioned a gift. I found a master craftsman in New York who created custom fountain pens for heads of state and celebrities. I had him make a Mont Blanc in Caroline's favorite color, a deep emerald green with gold accents, and an inscription that read, "To Caroline May, you always sign your own name." When I presented it to her at her bridal shower, she actually teared up. Emily, this is beautiful. This is the nicest thing you've ever done for me. She posted photos of it on social media immediately. Look at this gorgeous gift from my sister. So thoughtful, hatch blessed. Bridal shower / sister love. What she didn't know was that I'd already spoken with the wedding planner, suggesting that for the signing ceremony, where Caroline and Daniel would sign the investment contract as a symbolic joining of their families, this pen would be perfect. The photographer could get beautiful close-ups of the inscription of Caroline using this meaningful gift to sign such an important document. The wedding planner loved the idea. She'd already arranged for the signing to happen during the reception with the contract displayed on an easel, so guests could witness this historic moment. Every signature would be photographed from multiple angles. Every moment would be documented. The wedding was 2 weeks away. I had evidence of Caroline's fraud carefully preserved. I had recordings of every cruel comment, every dismissive remark, every moment they'd revealed their true nature. I had Helen Whitmore's proxy votes and my own hidden shareholdings giving me far more control than they realized. I had Daniel's secret, his dependence on my discretion, his debt to me that he'd never disclosed to his future wife. All I needed now was the perfect moment to use it. And Caroline was about to give it to her. The morning of Caroline's wedding, I woke at 5:30 in my hotel room and spent an hour reviewing every detail of what was about to happen. I'd planned this moment for weeks, running through contingencies and backup plans, making sure every piece was in position. By 7, I'd confirmed with my attorney that all documents were prepared. By 8, I'd verified with my banker that the protocols were ready to execute. By 9, I was calm-centered and dressed in a simple navy sheath dress that cost a fraction of what Caroline had probably spent on her shoes. I chose the dress deliberately. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Today wasn't about making an entrance. It was about making an exit that no one would forget. The 4 seasons. Dallas had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale, assuming your fairy tale cost approximately $500,000 and was funded by a company drowning in debt. I arrived just before the ceremony was scheduled to begin and stood in the grand foyer for a moment, taking it all in. 10,000 white roses. I counted the arrangements as I walked through massive displays on pedestals, garlands wrapped around columns, petals scattered across every surface like expensive snow. 3 crystal chandeliers hung from the ballroom ceiling, each one large enough to crush a car. The orchestra was already playing soft classical music, 18 musicians in formal attire positioned on a raised stage. A red carpet led from the entrance to the ballroom, lined with photographers who were snapping pictures of arriving guests as if this were the Oscars. Through the open doors I could see the ceremony space. White chairs arranged in perfect rows, an arch covered in more roses at the front, and enough lighting equipment to film a Hollywood production. This wedding was going to cost more than Margaret Industries had made in profit last quarter. The irony of Richard and Caroline spending money they didn't have to impress people who didn't care was not lost on me. I made my way inside and immediately felt the shift in energy as people noticed me. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Eyes followed me as I walked. I heard the whispers even though people tried to be discreet. "That's the adopted daughter, isn't it? I heard she's working as a consultant for the company now. Wonder why they even invited her. I thought they weren't close." "Probably felt obligated. Looks bad to exclude family completely." I smiled graciously at everyone I passed, nodding at people I'd known since childhood who'd never bothered to learn my name. I made small talk with a state senator who thought I was Caroline. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and found a spot near the back where I could observe without being observed. That's when I saw Helen Whitmore. She was seated in the 3rd row, which surprised me. As Daniel's mother, she should have been in the 1st row with immediate family. The fact that she'd been relegated to row 3 told me everything I needed to know about how Caroline viewed her future mother-in-law. Helen was wearing an elegant gray suit, her silver hair swept back, her posture perfect. She looked every inch the billionaire pharmaceutical executive she was, a woman who'd built her empire through intelligence and an absolute refusal to tolerate dishonesty. Our eyes met across the room. Helen's expression didn't change, but something passed between us, a moment of understanding, of recognition. She gave me the smallest nod, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. I returned it just as subtly. We'd spoken twice in the past month, once over coffee, and once over a secure phone line. Helen had made her position clear. She was uncomfortable with her son marrying into a family she didn't trust, but Daniel was an adult, and she wouldn't interfere with his choices. However, if the Crawford family revealed themselves to be exactly what she suspected they were, she would not hesitate to act. "I've spent 40 years building a reputation," she'd told me over coffee. "I will not let my son attach his name to corruption or cruelty. If they show you who they really are today, I want to know." I'd promised to keep her informed. Now seeing her seated in that third row like a piece of furniture to be positioned out of the way, I suspected she was already reaching her own conclusions. The ceremony began at noon exactly. Caroline made her entrance to Pachelbel's cannon, and I had to admit she looked beautiful. The $45,000 Vera Wang dress was stunning, all silk and lace and intricate beading that probably took a team of seamstresses months to complete. Her makeup was flawless, her hair perfectly styled. She glided down the aisle with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that she deserved to be the center of attention. Daniel stood at the altar, looking handsome and nervous. I watched his hands fidget with his cufflinks, saw the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He was uncomfortable, though probably only someone who knew his secret would recognize the signs. The officiant began the ceremony with the standard words about marriage and commitment. I only half listened, my mind already moving ahead to what would happen in the reception. But then Caroline began her personal vows, and something she said made me focus completely.